Hello everyone, I am the narrator and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never thought my passion for vintage dresses would lead me into a nightmare. But as I sit here, heart pounding, wondering if he's watching me right now, I realize how naive I was to think I could simply sell a few pieces and walk away. It started innocently enough. I'd been collecting vintage dresses for years, scouring thrift stores and estate sales for hidden gems. My closet was a rainbow of silk, taffeta, and lace, each dress with its own history and charm. But life has a way of changing your priorities. A divorce, mounting bills, and a need for a fresh start led me to the difficult decision to sell my beloved collection. I posted an ad online, showcasing some of my favorite pieces. The response was immediate. A man named Daniel messaged me, expressing interest in buying the entire collection. His enthusiasm matched my own, and we arranged for him to come see the dresses in person. When Daniel arrived at my apartment, he seemed perfectly normal. Clean-cut, early 30s, with an easy smile and a keen eye for fashion. He examined each dress with reverence, asking about their histories and complimenting my taste. For a moment, I felt a connection. Here was someone who understood my passion. We chatted as he looked through the collection, and I found myself opening up about my recent divorce and my plans to start anew. Daniel was sympathetic, even offering words of encouragement. By the time he left with several dresses in hand, I felt lighter, as if I'd not only made a sale but also a friend. That feeling didn't last long. A few days later, I noticed Daniel around my neighborhood. At first I thought it was a coincidence. Nashville isn't that big after all. But then I saw him more frequently, at the grocery store, the coffee shop, even outside my workplace. Each time, he'd give me that same easy smile, but something in his eyes had changed. They were colder, more calculating. I tried to brush it off, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. One evening, as I was leaving work, I found Daniel standing across the street watching me. He didn't approach, didn't say anything, just watched. My hands shook as I fumbled with my car keys, and I drove home with my heart in my throat. That night, I heard a soft knock on my apartment door. Through the peephole, I saw Daniel standing there, his expression eerily calm. I backed away, not daring to breathe. He knocked again, louder this time. I stood frozen, praying he would leave. After what felt like hours, he did. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak, every distant siren had me sitting bolt upright, wondering if he had come back. When morning finally came, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving my apartment, of potentially running into him again. As the day wore on, my fear turned to anger. Who did he think he was? I decided to confront him, to tell him to leave me alone or I'd call the police. But when I reached for my phone to find his number, my blood ran cold. There, on my coffee table, lay one of my vintage dresses, one I had sold to Daniel. My hands trembled as I picked it up, my mind racing. How did it get here? I was certain I had locked my door. I ran to check. It was still locked, panic rising in my throat. I searched my apartment, looking for any sign of intrusion. Everything seemed in order, except for that dress. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. They took my statement, but didn't seem overly concerned. Without clear evidence of a break-in, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to change my locks and call again if anything else happened. Frustrated and scared, I did change the locks. I also bought a security camera and installed it facing my front door. That night, I slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I woke to find another dress hanging on my bedroom door. My scream caught in my throat as I stared at it, the cheery floral print a stark contrast to the terror I felt. I checked the security camera footage with shaking hands. Nothing. No one had entered through the front door. This time, when I called the police, they took me more seriously. They searched my apartment but found no signs of forced entry. The officer suggested I stay with a friend for a few days, and I eagerly agreed. I packed a bag, constantly looking over my shoulder as if expecting Daniel to materialize at any moment. My friend Sarah was sympathetic but skeptical. "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" she asked gently. "Maybe you just forgot you brought the dresses home." I knew she was trying to help, to find a rational explanation, but her words stung. She hadn't seen the look in Daniel's eyes, hadn't felt the oppressive weight of being watched constantly. I stayed with Sarah for a week, jumping every time her phone rang or someone knocked on the door. I obsessively checked my apartment's security camera feed, but there was never anything out of the ordinary. Slowly, I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Had I imagined the whole thing? Determined to regain control of my life, I returned to my apartment. Everything was as I had left it. No new dresses, no signs of Daniel. I began to relax, to think that perhaps it had all been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by stress and lack of sleep. That illusion shattered the moment I walked into my bedroom. There, laid out on my bed like an offering, was every single dress I had sold to Daniel. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, noticing a piece of paper resting atop the colorful pile. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. "I've been watching you, Lisa. These dresses look better on you anyway. Put one on." "I'll be waiting." A scream bubbled up inside me, but I swallowed it down. I had to get out of there. I turned to run, only to find Daniel standing in the doorway. That easy smile still on his face, but his eyes cold and empty. "Hello, Lisa," he said softly. "I've missed you." I backed away, my mind racing. How had he gotten in? How long had he been here? Daniel took a step forward, and I noticed the glint of something metallic in his hand, a knife. "You shouldn't have tried to get rid of these dresses," he said, his voice eerily calm. "They're a part of you, and now so am I." In that moment, survival instinct took over. I grabbed the nearest dress and threw it at his face, momentarily obscuring his vision. In that split second, I darted past him, my shoulder slamming into his as I ran for the door. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the hardwood floor. I didn't look back, didn't stop to grab anything. I just ran. Out of my apartment, down the stairs, out into the street. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. Finally, I ducked into a busy coffee shop, my eyes wild as I scanned the room for any sign of Daniel. The barista took one look at me and asked if I was okay. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face, and asked to use their phone. The police arrived quickly this time. They took my statement, put out an APB on Daniel, and escorted me to the station. As I sat there, wrapped in a scratchy blanket and sipping lukewarm coffee, the reality of the situation crashed over me. My home wasn't safe. My life as I knew it was over. In the days that followed, I stayed with Sarah again. The police searched my apartment and found evidence of Daniel's obsession, photos of me, notes detailing my daily routine, even a makeshift shrine hidden in my closet. They assured me they would find him, but their words brought little comfort. I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Even as I sit here now, in a new apartment in a new city, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I see a vintage dress in a store window, my heart races. Every unfamiliar face on the street could be him. The police never found Daniel. Sometimes I wonder if they ever will. But I know he's out there, waiting. And every night as I double-check my locks and set my alarm, I can't help but wonder, will this be the night he comes back for me in his beloved dresses? My love for vintage fashion, once a source of joy and self-expression, has become a waking nightmare. And as I hang up my new modern clothes in my closet, I can't help but miss the colorful array of history and style that once filled it. But the cost of that passion was too high. Now, I dress for survival, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the day Daniel decides it's time to complete his collection. The hum of machinery was my lullaby, the emptiness of the warehouse my companion. But on that fateful night, the whispers I overheard shattered my mundane world, plunging me into a nightmare I never saw coming. I've always been a night owl. So when I landed the night shift security gig at the distribution center in New Jersey, it felt like a perfect fit. The pay wasn't great, but it was easy work. Most nights, I'd make my rounds, check the security cameras, and then kill time reading or watching videos on my phone. The silence of the massive warehouse was broken only by the occasional whir of a forklift or the distant rumble of trucks on the nearby highway. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., nodded to the day shift guy as he practically ran out the door, and settled in for another uneventful 8 hours. I did my first round at midnight, flashlight in hand, weaving through the maze of shelves stacked high with boxes and crates. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it. Voices, low and urgent, coming from the loading dock. My first thought was that some employees had stayed late, but something about the tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I switched off my flashlight and crept closer, staying hidden behind a stack of pallets. Through the gaps, I could see a small group huddled together. I recognized Tony, the shift supervisor, and a couple of other guys I'd seen around but didn't name. They were unloading boxes from a truck that definitely wasn't on any manifest I'd seen. "Make sure everything's accounted for," Tony was saying, his voice tense. "We can't afford any mistakes tonight." One of the others nodded. "Yeah, the boss won't be happy if anything goes missing. You know how he is." My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. This wasn't some late-night inventory check. Whatever was in those boxes, it wasn't supposed to be here. I must have shifted my weight or something because suddenly a piece of wood cracked under my foot. The conversation stopped abruptly, and Tony's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the area. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hard and suspicious. I held my breath, pressing myself against the crates, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, Tony seemed to dismiss the noise. "Probably just a rat," he muttered. "Let's get this done." I waited until they were back to work before I slowly, painfully slowly backed away. My mind was racing. What should I do? Report them? But to whom? Tony was the shift supervisor. the one person I'd normally go to with any issues. And what if they found out it was me who snitched? They could make my life hell, or worse. I made it back to the security office, my hands shaking as I poured myself a cup of coffee. I tried to focus on my regular tasks, but my eyes kept darting to the security feed, watching Tony and the others as they finished unloading the truck and dispersed. The rest of the shift crawled by. Every noise made me jump, convinced they were coming for me. When 6 a.m. finally rolled around, I practically ran to my car, looking over my shoulder the entire time. I didn't sleep that day. I kept replaying what I'd seen and heard, trying to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe there was an innocent explanation, but deep down, I knew better. The next night, I came in early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the day shift manager. Maybe I could casually mention something, see how he reacted. But as soon as I walked in, I could feel eyes on me. Tony was there, leaning against the wall, watching me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Hey," he said, his tone casual but his eyes hard. "Got a minute?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. He led me to a small break room and closed the door behind us. "You've been acting strange," he said, leaning against the door. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as fake as it felt. "Yeah, just tired. You know how it is." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could feel sweat beating on my forehead. "You know," he said slowly, "it's important to stay focused on the job. Distractions can be dangerous." The threat was clear, even if his words were vague. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Good," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. His grip was just a little too tight, his smile a little too wide. "Keep it that way." As soon as he left, I collapsed into a chair, my legs feeling weak. They knew, maybe not for certain, but they suspected I'd seen something, and they were warning me to keep my mouth shut. The next few shifts were a special kind of hell. I felt eyes on me constantly. Tony or one of the others always seemed to be nearby, watching. I tried to act normal, to do my job and keep my head down, but the stress was eating me alive. It was during one of these shifts that I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows and wondering if today was the day they decided I was too much of a risk. I had to do something. I waited until Tony and the others were busy with another late-night delivery. Then, heart pounding, I slipped into the office and used the landline to call the anonymous tip line for the police. My voice shook as I gave them all the details I could without revealing my identity. As I hung up, I heard footsteps approaching. I barely had time to get back to my post before Tony rounded the corner. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Everything all right?" he asked. I nodded, hoping my face didn't betray the panic I felt. "Yeah, just doing my rounds." He grunted and moved on, but I could feel his eyes on my back as I walked away. The next night was the longest of my life. Every minute felt like an hour as I waited, wondering if the police would show up, if Tony and the others would figure out what I'd done. I jumped at every noise, half expecting to see them coming for me with retribution in their eyes. It was nearly 4 a.m. when I heard the sirens. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a new wave of panic. What if they didn't find anything? What if Tony and the others had cleaned everything up? But as I watched the police cars pull up, followed by several unmarked vehicles, I knew this was it. Agents swarmed the building, and I could hear shouts and the sound of doors being broken down. I stayed in the security office, my heart racing as I watched it all unfold on the monitors. Tony and several others were let out in handcuffs, their faces a mix of anger and disbelief. As they were put into police cars, I saw Tony look directly at one of the security cameras, his eyes burning with hatred. He knew it was me. Somehow he knew. The aftermath was a blur of police interviews and internal investigations. The company tried to distance itself from what had happened, claiming they had no knowledge of the criminal activities. I didn't buy it for a second, but I kept my mouth shut. I'd said all I needed to say. I quit the job the next day. I couldn't go back there, couldn't face the memories or the lingering fear. But even as I walked out of that warehouse for the last time, I knew it wasn't over. The images of what I'd seen, the sound of Tony's voice as he threatened me, the look in his eyes as he was led away, they all haunted me. I moved to a different city, took a new job with normal hours in a brightly lit office, but I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, they'll find me. Every time I see a delivery truck, every time I hear a noise in the night, I wonder, is this it? Have they come to silence me for good? I did the right thing, I know that, but knowing doesn't make the fear go away. It doesn't stop me from looking over my shoulder or checking the locks twice before I go to bed. Because I learned a hard truth in that warehouse. Sometimes doing the right thing comes with a price, and I'm still waiting to see just how high that price might be. The flickering neon sign promised vacancy. What I found in that rundown motel was anything but empty. Sometimes the real horror isn't what you can see, but what you can't. And what's watching you when you think you're alone? I'd been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion as I navigated the empty Arizona highway. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving me in a world of shadows and headlights. I hadn't planned on stopping, but as my eyelids grew heavier with each passing mile, I knew I needed to find a place to crash for the night. That's when I saw it, a small, dilapidated motel just off the highway. The vacancy sign buzzed and flickered, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, the crunch under my tires eerily loud in the stillness of the night. The office was dim, lit only by the glow of an old TV. Behind the counter sat a man who looked as worn and tired as the building itself. His eyes, though, there was something off about them. Too alert. Too hungry. Need a room, I mumbled, fumbling for my wallet. He nodded, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes spreading across his face. Of course. How long will you be staying with us? Just for the night, heading out early tomorrow. He handed me a key, his fingers lingering a moment too long as they brushed against mine. Room 12, around back. Enjoy your stay. I suppressed a shudder as I headed back to my car. Something about this place felt wrong, but I was too tired to care. I just needed sleep. Room 12 was exactly what you'd expect from a cheap roadside motel. Faded wallpaper, a bed that creaked when I sat on it, and a bathroom that had seen better days. But it was a roof over my head, and right then, that was all that mattered. I took a quick shower, the water never quite getting hot enough to be comfortable. As I was drying off, I noticed something odd, a small red light blinking in the corner of the room. At first I thought it might be a smoke detector, but it was too low, tucked behind the air vent. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved closer, squinting in the dim light. That's when I saw it, a tiny camera lens, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. My blood ran cold. A camera in my room. I quickly scanned the rest of the space, my heart pounding. There, behind a tacky painting of a desert landscape, was another one. Panic set in as the realization hit me. I was being watched. Every move, every private moment, all captured on film. But why? And by whom? The manager. It had to be him. That look in his eyes, the way his touch lingered. He knew. He'd probably been doing this for who knows how long. I had to get out of there, fast. I threw on my clothes and started shoving my belongings into my bag. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps outside my door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. The footsteps stopped right outside. There was a moment of terrible silence, then a soft knock. Everything all right in there? It was the manager's voice. Calm and friendly, but with an undercurrent of something sinister. I thought I heard some noise. I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. My throat had closed up with fear. "I'm coming in to check," he said. And I heard the jingle of keys. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let him in. Couldn't let him know that I'd discovered his sick game. In a split-second decision, I wrenched open the window and climbed out, not caring about the noise I was making now. I hit the ground running, my bag bouncing against my back. I could hear shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the asphalt as I made for my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, I saw him in my rearview mirror, the manager, running towards me with a look of rage on his face. I slammed on the gas, peeling out of the parking lot in a spray of gravel. In my mirror, I could see him standing there, watching me drive away. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of his stare. I drove for hours, not daring to stop, jumping at every set of headlights I saw in my mirror. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I finally pulled over at a busy truck stop, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. What do I do now? Go to the police. But what evidence did I have? I hadn't taken photos of the cameras, hadn't recorded anything. It would be my word against his. And who knows how many people he had on his side. How deep this thing went. I sat there for a long time, my mind racing. Finally, I made a decision. I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't live with myself knowing that other unsuspecting travelers might fall victim to that perverted voyeur. I drove to the nearest police station, my stomach in knots. The officer who took my statement looked skeptical, but he assured me they would look into it. I didn't have much hope, but at least I'd done something. That night, I checked into a well-lit, busy hotel in a bigger city. I swept the room for cameras, checked every nook and cranny. Nothing. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that red blinking light, heard those heavy footsteps outside my door. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I'd imagined it all. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The next morning, I got a call from the police. They'd raided the motel and found exactly what I'd described, hidden cameras in several rooms, all feeding back to the manager's office. They'd arrested him, found hours of footage of unsuspecting guests. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was numb. In the days that followed, I gave more statements, identified the manager and a lineup. There was talk of a trial, of me testifying. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but I knew I had to do it for all the people who didn't know they'd been violated, who were still out there, blissfully unaware of what had happened to them. It's been months now, and I still can't stay in motels. Hell, I can barely stay in hotels. Every time I enter a new room, I find myself scanning for cameras, checking behind paintings and in air vents. I know it's paranoid, but I can't help it. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can see a tiny red light blinking in the corner of my room. I know it's not real, know it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but in those moments, I'm right back in room 12, feeling exposed, violated, watched. The trial is coming up soon. The prosecutor says they have a strong case, that with my testimony and the evidence they found, he'll go away for a long time. I want to believe her, want to think that this will all be over soon, but I know better. Even if he goes to jail, even if that motel is shut down and demolished, it won't change what happened. It won't erase the feeling of vulnerability, of invasion. It won't stop me from checking every room I enter, from flinching at every unexpected noise, because now I know the truth. The monsters aren't always hiding under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes they're on the other side of the lens, watching, waiting, violating your most private moments. And that knowledge, that's the kind of thing that stays with you long after the cameras stop rolling. So if you're ever driving down a lonely highway and see a flickering vacancy sign, think twice before you stop, because you never know who might be watching. And once you've been seen, really seen, you can never unsee yourself through their eyes. The forest was supposed to be my escape, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with nature. Instead, it became a twisted maze of terror, with a predator lurking in the shadows, waiting to make me his prey. I've always been an avid hiker, finding solace in the quiet of the woods and the challenge of conquering new trails. But after a messy breakup and a stressful few months at work, I needed more than just a weekend getaway. I decided to take a week off and head deep into the Adirondacks, far from cell service and the complications of my daily life. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I hiked for hours, marveling at the towering pines and the crisp mountain air. Each night, I'd set up camp, cook a simple meal over my portable stove, and fall asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest. On the third day, I decided to venture off the main trail. I'd heard about a hidden waterfall from a fellow hiker and was determined to find it. The path was overgrown and barely visible in places, but I pressed on, driven by the promise of discovering something few had seen. As the day wore on, I realized I'd miscalculated. The sun was sinking lower, and I still hadn't found the waterfall. Worse, I wasn't sure I could find my way back to the main trail. A knot of anxiety formed in my stomach as I checked my map and compass, trying to orient myself. That's when I saw it. A small cabin nestled among the trees. Relief washed over me. Surely whoever lived there could point me in the right direction, maybe even let me use a phone if they had one. I approached the cabin, noticing the worn wood and overgrown vegetation surrounding it. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years, but I held on to hope. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet forest. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Hello? Is anyone there? I'm lost and could use some help. Still nothing. I tried the door handle, surprised to find it unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior. Hello? I called out, stepping inside. "I'm sorry to intrude, Varna, but I really need help." My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I took in my surroundings. The cabin was sparse: a small bed in one corner, a wooden table with a single chair, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A thick layer of dust covered everything. As I moved further into the cabin, the floorboards groaned under my weight. I was about to turn back, realizing no one had been here in a long time, when something caught my eye. On the table was a notebook, its pages yellowed with age, but free from the dust that covered everything else. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the notebook and opened it. The handwriting inside was messy, almost frantic. As I read, my blood ran cold. Day 147, another one wandered too close today. Had to chase him off. They can't know I'm here, can't let them find me. This is my forest now. I flipped through more pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. The writer talked about protecting the forest from intruders, about setting traps and chasing off hikers. The most recent entry was dated just a week ago. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone was living out here, someone dangerous, and I was in their home. I dropped the notebook and spun around, ready to bolt out the door. But as I turned, I came face to face with a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with wild, unkempt hair and a beard that reached his chest. His clothes were tattered and stained, and in his hand he clutched a large hunting knife. But it was his eyes that terrified me the most. They were dark, almost black, and filled with a mix of rage and madness. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice rough from disuse. I raised my hands, trying to appear non-threatening. "I'm sorry I got lost. I was just looking for help. I'll leave right now, I promise." He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. "No one's supposed to be here. This is my forest. Mine." I feinted to the left, then dove to the right, hoping to slip past him. But he was faster than I expected. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. I yelled, more in shock than pain, and twisted away from him. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I grabbed the nearest object, the chair, and swung it at him with all my might. It connected with a sickening crack, and he stumbled backward, momentarily stunned. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the darkening forest. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush and shouting incoherently. My lungs burned as I ran, dodging trees and leaping over fallen logs. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get away from him. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts, but I didn't slow down. I could hear a river up ahead and changed course towards it. Maybe I could lose him in the water, or at least throw him off my trail. As I burst through the tree line, I saw the river, wide, fast-moving, and full of rocks. For a split second, I hesitated. The current looked dangerous, but the sound of my pursuer crashing through the forest behind me made up my mind. I plunged into the icy water, gasping as it hit me like 1,000 tiny knives. The current was stronger than I expected, pulling me downstream as I struggled to keep my head above water. I could hear the man shouting from the riverbank, his voice full of fury, but his voice grew fainter as the river carried me away, until I could no longer hear him over the rush of water. I don't know how long I was in the river. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, I managed to grab onto a low-hanging branch and pull myself to shore. I collapsed on the bank, coughing and shivering but alive. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation set in. I was lost, soaking wet, and it was getting dark. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to civilization, and somewhere out there, a madman was hunting me. I forced myself to my feet, knowing I couldn't stay by the river. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping against hope that I was heading towards safety and not deeper into his territory. The night was the longest of my life. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me jumping, sure that he had found me. I kept moving, afraid that if I stopped, I'd never get up again. As dawn broke, I heard something that made my heart leap, the distant sound of traffic. I quickened my pace, ignoring my aching muscles and the cuts and bruises that covered my body. Finally, mercifully, I broke through the tree line and saw a road. I flagged down the first car I saw, probably looking like a wild man myself. The elderly couple inside looked terrified at first, but something in my eyes must have conveyed my desperation. They let me in and drove me to the nearest police station. The next few days were a blur of police statements, search parties, and concerned looks from doctors and nurses. They found the cabin, found evidence of long-term habitation, but no sign of the man himself. They assured me they would keep looking, that they would find him, but I knew better. That man, whoever he was, knew those woods better than anyone. He'd survived out there for who knows how long, evading detection. The forest was his home, his hiding place, his hunting ground. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about those dark, mad eyes. I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear his voice on the wind, calling me back to his forest. I don't hike anymore. Hell, I can barely bring myself to walk through the park near my apartment. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I'm back in that cabin, reading those chilling words in his journal, and I wonder, how many others has he chased? How many didn't make it out of his forest? I know one thing for certain, I'll never set foot in those woods again, because sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't the ones with claws and fangs. Sometimes they're all too human, driven mad by isolation and believing they own the wilderness. And once you've encountered one, you never feel truly safe in the forest again. The crackling campfire was supposed to be comforting, but as night fell and strange noises echoed through the woods, it became a beacon, not for us, but for something sinister lurking in the darkness. Our family camping trip had turned into a nightmare, and we were the prey. I've always loved camping. There's something about disconnecting from the world, breathing in the fresh air, and spending quality time with family that rejuvenates the soul. So when I suggested a week-long trip to a remote campsite in the Rockies, my wife Sarah and our kids, Emily, 14, and Max, 10, were all in. The first couple of days were perfect. We hiked trails, fished in the nearby stream, and spent evenings around the campfire telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The kids were having a blast, free from their phones and video games, rediscovering the simple joys of nature. It was on the third night that things began to change. We were sitting around the fire after dinner when Max suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing but the usual nighttime forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl. But then, faintly, I caught it, a snapping twig. Too deliberate to be an animal. "It's probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound confident. But something in my gut told me it wasn't. Sarah met my eyes across the fire. and I could see my own unease reflected there. "Maybe we should turn in early tonight," she suggested, her voice tight. We doused the fire and retreated to our tents. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. I lay awake, listening, my body tense. Just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. But then I heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath beside me. She'd heard it too. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking slightly. "I'm going to check it out," I whispered. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't," she hissed. "What if it's a bear?" But we both knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't wear boots. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent. For a long, terrifying moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, a shadow moved across the tent wall, the silhouette of a person, standing motionless, watching us. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I wanted to confront them, to shout and scare them off, but fear kept me paralyzed. What if they weren't alone? What if they were armed? After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the shadow moved away. I heard the crunch of leaves as they retreated into the woods. Neither Sarah nor I slept that night. We lay there, clutching each other, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, we emerged from the tent exhausted and on edge. The campsite looked normal in the morning light, but something felt off. As I started the fire for breakfast, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Boot prints in the soft earth around our tents, confirming that last night hadn't been a dream. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaky as she stared at the prints. I nodded, but as I turned to start packing up, I froze. Our car, parked just at the edge of the campsite, had been tampered with. The tires were slashed, and the hood was up, revealing a tangle of disconnected wires. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her hand over her mouth. The kids came out of their tent, rubbing sleep from their eyes. "What's going on?" Emily asked, immediately sensing the tension. I tried to keep my voice calm as I explained that we needed to pack up and leave, making up a story about a family emergency. But as we were rolling up the tents, Max pointed to the tree line. "Dad," he said, his voice trembling. "There's someone watching us." I spun around, following his gaze. There, partially hidden behind a large pine, was a figure, a man, dressed in dark clothes, just standing there staring at us. As soon as he realized we'd spotted him, he melted back into the forest. Panic set in. We abandoned any pretense of calm and started shoving things haphazardly into our backpacks. I tried the satellite phone, but there was no signal. We were on our own. "We need to start hiking out," I said, shouldering the heaviest pack. "Stay close together and keep your eyes open." We set off down the trail, moving as quickly as we could while still staying alert. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just days ago, now felt oppressive. Every shadow could be hiding our stalker. Every snapping twig could be him following us. We hiked for hours, the weight of our packs and the constant fear wearing us down. The kids were exhausted, but terror kept them moving. As the sun began to set, we realized we needed to find a place to stop for the night. We found a small clearing, set back from the trail and partially hidden by a cluster of boulders. It wasn't ideal, but it was defensible. We didn't dare light a fire, instead huddling together in the growing darkness, sharing what little food we had packed in our day packs. That night, was the longest of my life. We took turns keeping watch, though I'm not sure any of us actually slept. Every sound, every shadow had us on high alert. Twice I was sure I saw movement at the edge of our camp, but when I shone the flashlight, there was nothing there. As dawn broke, we quickly packed up and hit the trail again. We had been hiking for maybe an hour when Emily suddenly stopped, her face pale. "I think I saw him," she whispered, pointing to a ridge above us. I followed her gaze and caught a glimpse of movement, definitely a person, definitely following us. My heart sank. I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, we had lost him during the night. "Run," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Now." We took off down the trail, no longer caring about stealth or conserving energy. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, getting closer. Sarah was in the lead, pulling Max along by the hand. Emily was right behind them, her long legs eating up the distance. I brought up the rear, constantly looking back. We burst out of the tree line onto a wider trail, and I felt a surge of hope. This had to lead somewhere, to a ranger station or a road. But as we rounded a bend, my heart sank. The trail ended abruptly at a steep cliff face. We were trapped. I spun around, pushing the kids behind me as our pursuer emerged from the trees. He was a large man, dressed in ragged clothes, with wild eyes and a matted beard. In his hand, he clutched a wicked-looking hunting knife. "Yeah, this is my forest," he growled, his voice rough from disuse. "You shouldn't be here." "We're leaving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We don't want any trouble." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Too late for that. You've seen me. Can't let you leave now." He took a step forward, and I heard Sarah whimper behind me. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this. We were cornered, exhausted, and unarmed against a madman with a knife. Just then, a sound cut through the tension. A helicopter. We all looked up to see a search and rescue chopper passing overhead. Our stalker's face twisted in rage and fear. "No," he shouted. "This is my forest, mine." In his moment of distraction, I saw our chance. I lunged forward, catching him off guard. We grappled, his knife coming dangerously close to my face before I managed to knock it away. We rolled on the ground, each fighting for dominance. I heard Sarah screaming, the kids crying, but it all seemed distant. My entire world had narrowed to this fight. Somehow, I ended up on top, my hands around his throat. I could see the madness in his eyes slowly fade, replaced by fear as he realized he was losing. I don't know how long I held him there, but suddenly there were other voices, other hands pulling me away. The search and rescue team had seen us from the air and landed nearby. The next few hours were a blur of questions, medical checks, and comforting my traumatized family. We learned that our attacker was a former soldier, missing for years, driven mad by PTSD and isolation. He had been living in the woods, terrorizing hikers and campers for who knows how long. It's been months since that camping trip, but the fear lingers. The kids have nightmares, and Sarah jumps at every unexpected noise. As for me, I can't look at the woods the same way anymore. What was once a place of peace and adventure now feels threatening, full of hidden dangers. We're in therapy, working through the trauma, but I know we'll never be the same. Our innocence, our trust in the beauty and safety of nature was shattered in those terrifying days. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear phantom footsteps circling our house. And in my dreams, I'm back in those woods, running from a shadow that never tires and never stops, because now I know the truth. Sometimes the most dangerous predators in the forest walk on two legs, and their hunting grounds are closer to home than we'd like to believe. The story was supposed to be my big break, but as I stood there in the clearing, surrounded by robed figures with madness in their eyes, I realized it might just be the death of me. Sometimes, the truth is better left buried, especially when it's guarded by those who've lost their grip on reality. I've always been drawn to the unexplained, the mysteries that lurk just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. It's what led me to become a journalist in the first place. But nothing in my years of chasing stories could have prepared me for what I uncovered in that small town in rural Maine. It started with a tip from an old college friend. He'd heard rumors of strange disappearances in his hometown, people vanishing without a trace, local authorities seeming unconcerned. It wasn't much to go on, but my instincts told me there was more to the story. I arrived in town on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. The place seemed frozen in time, all faded storefronts and wary looks from locals. I checked into the only motel in town, a run-down place that had seen better days, and started asking questions. At first, people were tight-lipped. They'd change the subject or suddenly remember urgent errands. But as I dug deeper, piecing together snippets of overheard conversations and old newspaper clippings, a pattern emerged. The disappearances weren't random. They all seemed to revolve around the dense forest that bordered the town. Hikers who never returned, campers whose sites were found abandoned, locals who ventured too far into the woods and were never seen again. One name kept coming up in hushed whispers. Elder Thomas. He was some kind of religious leader, though no one could tell me exactly what faith he preached. All I knew was that he and his followers had a compound deep in the forest, far from prying eyes. It took some doing, but I finally found someone willing to talk. An old man named Frank, who'd lost his daughter to what he called that damned cult years ago. He told me about strange rituals in the woods, about how Elder Thomas claimed to commune with ancient beings, promising his followers power beyond their wildest dreams. But it ain't power they're getting, Frank said, his rheumy eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and anger. It's madness, pure madness. He gave me rough directions to the compound, warning me not to go alone. But I was too eager, too sure of my own abilities. I thanked him and set off into the forest the next morning, armed with only my notebook, a camera, and a woefully inadequate sense of self-preservation. The forest was dense, the trail barely visible in places. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the air seemed to thicken, filled with an oppressive silence, no birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Just the sound of my own labored breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. The trees all started to look the same, and more than once I feared I'd gotten turned around. But just as I was about to give up and try to find my way back to town, I saw it, a clearing up ahead, unnatural in its perfect circularity. And in the center, a group of people dressed in tattered robes, swaying in unison to some unheard rhythm. I crouched behind a large oak, my heart pounding as I watched the scene unfold. There were maybe 24 of them, men and women of all ages. At the head of the group stood a tall figure I assumed must be Elder Thomas. He wore a robe of deep crimson, in stark contrast to the dull browns of his followers. As I watched, Elder Thomas raised his arms to the sky and began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. The others joined in, their voices rising in a discordant chorus that sent chills down my spine. I raised my camera, knowing this was the evidence I needed to blow the story wide open. But as I focused the lens, something impossible happened. The air in the center of the clearing began to shimmer, like heat rising off hot asphalt. And then, to my horror, it began to tear. There's no other way to describe it. Reality itself seemed to rip open, revealing a swirling vortex of colors that hurt my eyes to look at. From this impossible tear came a sound, a low, pulsing hum that I felt in my bones more than heard. The cultists' chanting reached a fever pitch, and I saw several of them step forward, arms outstretched towards the vortex. I wanted to look away, to run, but I was frozen in place. I watched as the first cultist reached the edge of the tear. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like tearing flesh, tentacles of pure darkness shot out, wrapping around the person and yanking them into the vortex. The scream that followed will haunt me for the rest of my days. More cultists stepped forward, each meeting the same fate. And through it all, Elder Thomas stood with his arms raised, a look of rapturous joy on his face. I don't know what made me gasp. Horror, shock, disbelief. But that small sound was enough. Elder Thomas's head snapped in my direction, his eyes locking onto mine with terrifying intensity. "Intruder," he bellowed, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "Bring them to me." I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the forest, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me at every step. I could hear them behind me, their chanting now a war cry as they gave chase. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. But the forest seemed to work against me, paths that should have led to safety instead, looping back towards my pursuers. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I broke through the tree line onto a narrow dirt road. A battered pickup truck sat idling nearby, and behind the wheel was Frank, the old man who'd warned me. "Get in!" he shouted, already reaching across to fling open the passenger door. I didn't hesitate. I dove into the truck just as the first of the cultists emerged from the forest. Frank floored it, the tires kicking up a spray of gravel as we peeled away. In the rearview mirror, I could see Elder Thomas standing at the edge of the forest, watching us drive away. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of his gaze. This wasn't over. Frank drove like a man possessed, taking turns at breakneck speed and muttering what sounded like prayers under his breath. It wasn't until we crossed the town limits that he finally eased up on the gas. "Told you not to go alone," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with relief. I opened my mouth to respond, to thank him, to ask questions, but no words came out. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me shaky and nauseous. What had I just witnessed? What was that thing in the clearing? My mind struggled to process it all. We drove straight to the sheriff's office. I spilled everything, my words tumbling out in a frantic jumble. To his credit, the sheriff listened patiently, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he glanced at Frank as if to say, "Can you believe this guy?" In the end, he agreed to send a couple of deputies out to investigate, but I knew it was useless. Whatever had happened in that clearing, whatever Elder Thomas and his followers had summoned, it wasn't something that could be handled by small-town law enforcement. I left town that night, my notes incomplete, my camera lost somewhere in the forest. The story I'd come to uncover was bigger and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. But I knew no one would believe me. How could they, when I barely believed it myself? In the months since, I've tried to forget what I saw in those woods. I've thrown myself into safer, more mundane stories. But at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear that unearthly hum, still see that tear in reality, those dark tentacles reaching out. And sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder if I truly escaped, or if perhaps, in some way I can't quite grasp, a part of me is still there in that clearing, forever running from the madness that lurks in the heart of those dark woods. I've thought about going back, about trying to expose the truth, but then I remember Elder Thomas's eyes, the way they seem to see right through me. And I know that some stories are better left untold, some truths better left buried. Because sometimes the price of knowledge is too high, and in the battle between truth and sanity, sanity must win. Even if it means living with the gnawing certainty that out there, in a forest in Maine, something ancient and terrible is stirring. And one day, it might not be content to stay hidden in the shadows. The sound of shattering glass pierced the air, and in that moment, I knew our typical night at the bar had morphed into a waking nightmare. One man's spiral into madness had trapped us all, turning our sanctuary of laughter and drinks into a hostage situation where every breath could be our last. I've been tending bar at the Rusty Nail for nearly 5 years now. It's a local joint in downtown New Orleans. Nothing fancy, but it's got character. Most nights it's a mix of regulars and tourists, all looking for a good time and a stiff drink. I've seen my fair share of rowdy patrons and bar fights, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a Tuesday, usually one of our slower nights. The regulars were in their usual spots. Old Jim nursing his whiskey at the end of the bar, the college kids playing pool in the corner, and a handful of tourists soaking in the New Orleans vibe. The night was humming along, the air filled with the soft jazz from our ancient jukebox and the murmur of conversation. Around midnight, he walked in. I noticed him right away. You develop a sixth sense in this job for trouble. He was a big guy, probably in his late 30s, with wild eyes and a nervous energy that set my teeth on edge. He sat at the bar and ordered a shot of tequila, downing it in one gulp before immediately ordering another. I kept an eye on him as I served other customers, noticing how his eyes darted around the room, how his hands shook slightly as he drank. As he lifted his glass after his fourth shot, I decided it was time to slow him down. "Hey, buddy," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "How about some water on the house?" He glared at me, his eyes suddenly focusing with an intensity that made me take a step back. I didn't ask for water. He growled, "Give me another shot." I hesitated, weighing my options, push back too hard, and he might explode, give in, and risk him getting even more out of control. Before I could decide, he stood up abruptly, his bar stool clattering to the floor. "You think you can tell me what to do?" He shouted, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the bar. Everyone fell silent, all eyes turning to us. I raised my hands, trying to diffuse the situation easy. "Now, I'm just looking out for you. Why don't we—" I never finished that sentence in one fluid motion. He grabbed his empty shot glass and hurled it against the wall behind me. The sound of shattering glass was like a starting pistol, sending everyone into motion. Most of the patrons made a dash for the door, but the guy was quicker. He vaulted over the bar, sending bottles crashing to the floor, and positioned himself between the crowd and the exit. Nobody's going anywhere. He roared, brandishing a jagged piece of broken bottle like a weapon. My heart was pounding so hard. I could feel it in my throat. I looked around the room, taking stock of who was left. Old Jim, too drunk to have made it to the door. The college kids huddled together by the pool table. A couple of tourists frozen in fear at their table, and my co-worker Jake, who had been in the back and now stood in the doorway to the kitchen, his eyes wide with shock. The guy paced back and forth in front of the door, muttering to himself. I caught fragments of what he was saying. Something about people watching him, about needing to protect himself. It was clear he wasn't in his right mind, which made the situation even more dangerous. I caught Jake's eye and gave a tiny nod towards the phone behind the bar. He understood, slowly inching his way towards it. But the guy saw the movement and let out a roar of rage. Don't even think about it, he yelled, rushing towards Jake with the broken bottle raised. Whoa, whoa, I shouted, desperate to draw his attention away from Jake. Nobody's doing anything. We're all just going to stay calm, right? He spun towards me, his eyes wild. Calm, calm. How can I be calm when they're after me, when they're everywhere, watching, waiting? I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Who's after you, man? Maybe we can help. He laughed, a harsh grating sound that sent chills down my spine. You can't help. Nobody can help. They're too powerful. Too many. One of the tourists, a middle-aged woman, let out a quiet sob. The guy's head snapped in her direction, and I saw his grip tighten on the broken bottle. Shut up, he snarled. One more sound, and Hey, I interrupted, desperate to keep his focus away from the terrified patrons. Why don't you tell me more about who's after you? I want to understand for a moment. I thought he might lunge at me, but then something in his expression shifted and he began to talk. He spun a tale of government conspiracies, of hidden cameras and microphones, of agents following his every move as he spoke. His agitation grew, his free hand gesticulating wildly, while the other still clutched the makeshift weapon. I nodded along, making sympathetic noises, all the while trying to catch the eye of anyone who might be able to help. But we were trapped. The windows were barred, a safety measure that now felt like a cruel joke, and he was. Blocking the only door. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. I lost track of how long we'd been there, listening to his rambling monologue, punctuated by moments of terrifying lucidity when he'd focus on one of us with those wild eyes. At some point I became aware of a sound outside, sirens growing louder. Someone must have called the police. The guy heard it too, his ranting cutting off abruptly. You called them, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You brought them here? No, I said quickly, my heart racing. Nobody here called anyone. It's probably just a coincidence. You know how noisy the city can be. But he wasn't listening. His eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal looking for escape, and then they landed on old Jim, still slumped at the end of the bar. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The guy lunged towards Jim, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him off the bar stool. Jim, too drunk and confused to resist, stumbled as the guy pulled him close, pressing the jagged edge of the bottle against his throat. Everybody back, the guy shouted, or the old man gets it. I couldn't control faster than I could handle outside. I could hear voices, the police trying to establish contact, sir. A voice boomed through a megaphone. This is the New Orleans Police Department. We have the building surrounded. Come out with your hands up. The guy's face contorted with rage and fear. You see, he screamed. They're here. They've come for me. Jim whimpered, a thin line of blood appearing where the glass pressed against his skin. I knew I had to do something, or this was going to end in tragedy. Listen, I said, forcing myself to sound calm despite the terror coursing through me. Nobody in here called them, but they're here now, and they're not going to go away. But you haven't heard anyone yet if you let Jim go. If you put down the bottle, I promise I'll tell them about the people who are after you. I'll make them listen for a long moment." He just stared at me, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. I held his gaze silently, pleading, "Please, please let this work." And then miraculously his grip on Jim loosened. The old man stumbled away, collapsing into the arms of one of the college kids. The guy looked at the bottle in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. "They'll listen?" he asked, his voice suddenly small, almost childlike. I nodded, hardly daring to breathe. "They'll listen. I promise." Slowly he lowered the bottle. As soon as it left his hand, Jake vaulted over the bar and tackled him, pinning him to the ground. The door burst open, police flooding in with guns drawn. The next few hours were a blur of statements and questions. By the time I finally left the bar, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn in the days that followed. I learned more about the guy. He was a veteran struggling with PTSD and undiagnosed schizophrenia. He'd stopped taking his medication, leading to the psychotic break we'd witnessed. I still tend bar at the Rusty Nail. We've added some extra security measures, but mostly things have gone back to normal, yet sometimes late at night when the bar is quiet, I'll catch myself watching the door, half expecting to see him walk in again, because now I know how quickly a normal night can turn into a nightmare, and how thin the line is between sanity and madness, and I'll never take the safety of my little corner of the world for granted. Again, the abandoned factory was supposed to be empty, save for the ghosts of its industrial past. But as I stood there, surrounded by hostile squatters with murder in their eyes, I realized that the real danger wasn't in the machines that once roared to life here, but in the desperate souls who now called this place home. I never wanted to work the night shift at the old Detroit factory, but bills needed paying, and beggars can't be choosers. The job was simple enough. Patrol the massive complex, make sure no one was breaking in or vandalizing the place. It was boring work, but it paid the bills. The factory itself was a relic of Detroit's golden age, a sprawling maze of assembly lines, storage rooms and offices. Most of it was shrouded in darkness, the electricity long since cut off. My flashlight carved lonely paths through the gloom as I made my rounds. I'd been doing this job for about 3 months when it happened. It was a particularly cold night in November, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you long for a warm fire and a hot cup of coffee. I was about halfway through my shift, walking through one of the old assembly areas, when I heard voices. At first I thought I was imagining things. This place played tricks on you. Especially at night, the wind whistling through broken windows could sound like whispers, and settling metal could mimic footsteps. But as I stood there straining my ears, I realized these were definitely human voices. My heart started to race. In all my time working here, I'd never encountered anyone sure. There were rumors of homeless people sometimes seeking shelter in abandoned buildings like this, but I'd never seen any evidence of it. I should have called it in right then, should have radioed for backup or even called the cops, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate, figuring it was probably just some teenagers looking for a spooky place to hang out. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space as I got closer. I could make out words, fragments of conversation. They were arguing about something, their voices tense and angry. I rounded a corner, and there they were, a group of people, maybe 6 or 7, huddled around a small fire. They'd built in an old oil drum. They looked rough, dirty clothes, unkempt hair, the kind of weariness that comes from living on the streets for a moment. We just stared at each other, equally surprised. Then one of them, a tall guy with a scraggly beard, stood up. "Well, well," he said, his voice gravelly and cold. "Look what we have here." I held up my hands, trying to look non-threatening. "I'm just the night watchman," I said, my voice shakier than I would have liked. "I'm not here to cause any trouble." The tall guy laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the factory walls. "Trouble? Nah, we're not trouble. We're just trying to survive. This is our home now, and you're trespassing." I took a step back, suddenly very aware of how outnumbered I was. "Look, I don't want any problems. Why don't I just leave and we can pretend this never happened?" But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The others had gotten to their feet, now forming a loose circle around me. I could see the desperation in their eyes, the kind that makes people dangerous. "Can't do that," the tall guy said, shaking his head. "You've seen us now. Might go running to the cops, get us all thrown out in the cold. Can't have that, can we?" My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this. "I won't tell anyone, I promised, I swear. I'll even bring you guys some supplies, food, blankets, whatever you need for a moment." I thought it might work. I saw a flicker of uncertainty in some of their eyes, but then a woman stepped forward, her face hard. "We can't trust him," she spat. "He's one of them, probably thinks we're nothing but trash." The mood shifted palpably. I could feel the hostility radiating off them in waves. The tall guy nodded, slowly reaching into his pocket and pulling out a wicked-looking knife. "Sorry, friend," he said, not sounding sorry at all, "but we can't take that chance." I backed away, my heart pounding so hard. I thought it might burst out of my chest. "You don't want to do this," I said, my voice rising in panic. "Think about what you're doing. This isn't you. You're not killers." But I could see in their eyes that my words weren't reaching them. They advanced slowly, like wolves closing in on wounded prey. I looked around desperately for something, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a length of pipe lying on the ground nearby. I dove for it, my fingers closing around the cold metal. Just as the first of them reached me, I swung wildly, more to create space than to actually hit anyone. They backed off, momentarily surprised by my sudden move. "Back off," I shouted, brandishing the pipe. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will if I have to." The tall guy with the knife laughed again. "You against all of us. I don't like your odds-on friend." He was right, of course. I was outnumbered and trapped, but adrenaline and fear can make you do crazy things. In that moment, I decided that if I was going down, I was going down fighting. What followed was a blur of violence and desperation. I swung the pipe, connecting with flesh and bone. They came at me from all sides, fists and feet flying. I felt pain explode across my face as someone landed a solid punch. Warm blood trickled down from my nose, the metallic taste filling my mouth. I don't know how long the fight lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Somehow, miraculously, I managed to break free from their circle. I ran, my lungs burning, my body aching. I could hear them behind me, their shouts echoing through the empty factory. I knew the layout better than they did, and I used that to my advantage. I weaved through the machinery, taking sharp turns and doubling back when I could. At one point, I knocked over a stack of old pallets, creating a barrier between me and my pursuers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made it to the security office. I slammed the door shut behind me, fumbling with shaking hands to lock it. I could hear them outside, pounding on the door, shouting threats with trembling fingers. I dialed 911-1. When the operator answered, I could barely get the words out through my ragged breathing and the blood still flowing from my nose. "Please," I gasped. "I need help." I'm at the old auto factory on Jefferson. There are people here. They tried to kill me. Please hurry. The wait for the police to arrive was the longest of my life. I sat huddled in the corner of the office, the pipe still clutched in my white-knuckled grip, listening to the squatters try to break down the door. Every crash made me flinch, sure that this would be the one that would send them spilling into the room, but the door held, and eventually I heard the blessed sound of sirens approaching. The pounding on the door stopped, replaced by the sound of running feet as the squatters fled. When the police finally got to me, I broke down. The adrenaline wore off, leaving me shaking and sobbing as I tried to explain what had happened. They searched the factory but found no sign of the squatters, just the remnants of their camp and the evidence of our violent encounter. I quit that job the next day. Couldn't bear the thought of going back to that place, of walking those dark halls, knowing what lurked in the shadows for weeks. After I jumped at every sound, saw potential attackers in every stranger on the street, the police never found the squatters. Sometimes I wonder what happened to them, if they found another abandoned building to call home, or if they're still out there desperate and dangerous. I've got a new job now, one that doesn't involve dark, empty buildings or night shifts, but I'll never forget that night in the factory. Never forget how quickly a routine job turned into a fight for my life. And I'll never look at abandoned buildings the same way again, because now I know that sometimes the most dangerous things lurking in the shadows are all too human. The silence in my son's room was deafening. Where there should have been the soft, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping infant, there was nothing in that moment. As I stared at the empty crib, I realized that the nightmare I was living was far worse than any I could have imagined. I never thought I'd be a single mom, but life has a way of throwing curveballs. My ex walked out when I was 5 months pregnant, leaving me to navigate the challenges of motherhood alone. But from the moment I held my son Jacob in my arms, I knew I'd do anything for him. The first few months were a blur of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and moments of pure joy. As I watched my little boy grow, we fell into a routine, just the two of us against the world. Every night I'd rock Jacob to sleep, singing softly as his eyelids grew heavy. I'd place him gently in his crib, always making sure the baby monitor was on before I left the room. That night started like any other. I put Jacob to bed around 8 p.m., kissed his forehead and whispered, "I love you," before closing the door. I spent a few hours catching up on housework and watching TV, enjoying the rare moment of quiet around midnight. I decided to turn in. I was exhausted, looking forward to a few hours of sleep before Jacob's inevitable middle-of-the-night wake-up. I peeked into his room on my way to bed, as I always did. The soft glow of his nightlight illuminated his crib, and I could see the gentle rise and fall of his chest as he slept. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first I couldn't place it. Then I realized it was silence, the white noise machine in Jacob's room, which usually hummed through the baby monitor, was off. A tendril of unease curled in my stomach. As I reached for the monitor, the screen was dark, dead. I told myself not to panic. The batteries must have died, that's all. But as I swung my legs out of bed, my heart began to race. I padded down the hall to Jacob's room, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. The door was closed just as I'd left it, but as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. Something felt wrong. The air seemed too still, too quiet. I pushed the door open slowly, holding my breath. The nightlight was off, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking. The room flooded with light and my world shattered. The crib was empty for a moment. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This had to be a dream, a horrible nightmare. I blinked hard, willing the scene in front of me to change, but the crib remained empty, the blankets rumpled where Jacob should have been Jacob. I called out, my voice trembling, "Baby, where are you?" Silence answered me. I tore through the room, looking under the crib, in the closet, anywhere a baby could possibly be. But deep down I knew Jacob wasn't here. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Had I sleepwalked? Moved him without remembering? But no, I could still picture him sleeping peacefully when I checked on him before bed, with shaking hands. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911-1. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline in the storm of my panic. 911-1. What's your emergency? My baby. I choked out, tears streaming down my face. My baby's gone. Someone took him. Please, you have to help me. The next hours passed in a blur. Police swarmed my house, asking questions. I could barely focus on answering. They searched every inch of the property but found no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no picked locks. It was as if Jacob had simply vanished into thin air. I sat on the couch, clutching Jacob's favorite stuffed elephant, as the detective gently asked me to go over the evening one more time. Had I seen anything suspicious? Heard anything unusual? No, and no, it had been a normal night right up until the moment it became the worst night of my life. As dawn broke, casting an eerily cheerful glow through the windows, the initial frenzy of the investigation settled into a tense waiting game. An Amber Alert had been issued. Jacob's face, his chubby cheeks, his bright blue eyes, the cowlick that never stayed down, was plastered across every news channel. Friends and family began to arrive, offering support. I could barely acknowledge. Their words of comfort fell on deaf ears. All I could think about was Jacob. Was he scared? Was he crying for me? Was he... I couldn't even allow myself to finish that thought. Days passed in a haze of police interviews, sleepless nights, and desperate pleas to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jacob's empty crib. The police explored every angle. They interviewed my ex, but he had an airtight alibi. He was on a business trip in Europe. They looked into my background, my friends, my enemies. Not that I had any. They questioned the neighbors, searched nearby woods, and checked security cameras from every business in a 5-mile radius. Nothing as the days turned into weeks. I could feel the investigation losing momentum. The sympathetic looks from the detectives turned pitying. The media attention waned. People started to talk in hushed tones about moving on and finding closure. But how could I move on? How could I find closure when my baby was out there somewhere, needing me? I threw myself into the search, plastering Jacob's face on every telephone pole, storefront, and community board I could find. I created social media pages, begging people to share Jacob's story. I appeared on every local news station that would have me, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another day of this waking nightmare, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. Elderly. Is this Jacob's mother? The woman asked. My heart leapt into my throat. Yes it is. Do you know something about Jacob? There was a pause, and then I think I found him. The world tilted on its axis. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Where is he? Is he okay? He's here at Fairview Park 1. I found him abandoned near the playground. He's okay. He's not hurt. I called the police. They're on their way. I was already running out the door, yet keys in hand before she finished speaking. The drive to the park was a blur. I ran every red light, my heart pounding in time with the mantra in my head. Please be okay. Please be okay. Please be okay. I screeched into the parking lot, just as a police cruiser pulled up together. We raced towards the playground, and there, sitting on a bench with a kindly-looking old woman, was Jacob. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees in front of him. He looked up at me with those big blue eyes, and for a moment, I was afraid he wouldn't recognize me. But then his face lit up with a smile that could outshine the sun. "Mama," he cried, reaching for me. I gathered him in my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He was here. He was safe. He was home. The investigation into Jacob's disappearance and mysterious reappearance is ongoing. There are so many unanswered questions. Who took him? Why? And why bring him back? But in this moment, with Jacob sleeping peacefully in his crib, which is now in my room, those questions don't matter. All that matters is that he's here, he's safe, and I'm never letting him out of my sight again. I know the road ahead won't be easy. There will be trauma to work through for both of us. There will be lingering fears and sleepless nights, but we're together, and that's all that matters. As I watch Jacob sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, I make a silent promise. I will find out what happened. I will make sure those responsible are brought to justice, and I will do everything in my power to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Because now I know the truth. The world can be a dark and dangerous place, but it's also full of light and love and miracles. And sometimes, against all odds, lost things find their way home. The neon vacancy sign flickered like a dying heartbeat, a false beacon of safety in the growing darkness. I should have kept driving, should have trusted my instincts, but exhaustion clouded my judgment, and I pulled into the motel parking lot, unaware that I was walking into a nightmare of my own making. I'd been on the road for nearly 14 hours, pushing through fatigue. As I made my way across the country, this solo road trip was supposed to be my grand adventure, a chance to clear my head after a messy breakup and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the miles blurred together, all I wanted was a hot shower and a soft bed. The motel looked like a relic from the 1950s. All faded paint and rusted metal. But beggars can't be choosers, and I was desperate for rest. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, the crunch under my tires unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. The office was dimly lit, a single bulb casting more shadows than light. Behind the counter stood a man who looked as old and worn as the building itself. His eyes, though, were sharp and alert, studying me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "Need a room," I mumbled, fumbling for my wallet. He nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course. How long will you be staying with us, miss?" "Just for the night. I'm hitting the road early tomorrow." He handed me a key, his fingers lingering a moment too long. As they brushed against mine, "Room 13 around back. Enjoy your stay." I suppressed a shudder as I headed back to my car. Something about this place felt off, but I was too tired to care. I just needed sleep. Room 13 was exactly what you'd expect from a cheap roadside motel: faded wallpaper, a bed that creaked when I sat on it, and a bathroom that had seen better days. But it was a roof over my head, and right then, that was all that mattered. I took a quick shower, the water never quite getting hot enough to be comfortable. As I was drying off, I noticed something odd. A small red light blinking in the corner of the room. At first I thought it might be a smoke detector, but it was too low, tucked behind the air vent. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved closer, squinting in the dim light. That's when I saw it, a tiny camera lens, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. My blood ran cold. A camera. In my room, I quickly scanned the rest of the space where my heart pounding. There, behind a tacky painting of a desert landscape, was another one. Panic set in as the realization hit me. I was being watched. Every move, every private moment, all captured on film. But why? And by whom? The manager. It had to be him. That look in his eyes, the way his touch lingered. He knew. He'd probably been doing this for who knows how long. I had to get out of there. Fast. I threw on my clothes and started shoving my belongings into my bag. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps outside my door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. The footsteps stopped right outside. There was a moment of terrible silence, then a soft knock. "Everything all right in there?" It was the manager's voice. Calm and friendly, but with an undercurrent of something sinister. I thought I heard some noise. I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. My throat had closed up with fear. "I'm coming in to check," he said, and I heard the jingle of keys. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let him in. Couldn't let him know that I'd discovered his sick game. In a split-second decision, I wrenched open the window and climbed out. Not caring about the noise I was making now, I hit the ground running, my bag bouncing against my back. I could hear shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the asphalt as I made for my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, I saw him in my rearview mirror, the manager, running towards me with a look of rage on his face. I slammed on the gas, peeling out of the parking lot in a spray of gravel. In my mirror, I could see him standing there, watching me drive away. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of his stare. I drove for miles, not daring to stop, jumping at every set of headlights I saw in my mirror. My mind raced with questions. How long had he been doing this? How many other unsuspecting travelers had fallen victim to his voyeuristic scheme? It wasn't until I saw the lights of a small town ahead that I finally allowed myself to slow down. My hands were shaking as I pulled into a well-lit gas station. I needed to call the police to report what had happened, but as I reached for my phone, a horrifying thought struck me. My wallet. In my panic to escape, I'd left it in the motel room. A wave of nausea washed over me. My ID, my credit cards, everything. It was all back there, with him. He knew my name, my address. The thought made me physically ill. I sat there paralyzed with fear and indecision. Should I go back? The very idea made my skin crawl. But could I just leave it there? Leave him with all that information about me? Before I could decide, a pair of headlights pulled into the gas station. It was an old pickup truck, nothing remarkable about it. But as it parked next to me, I saw who was behind the wheel. The manager. Our eyes met. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. He'd followed me. He wasn't going to let me go that easily. I threw my car into drive, not even bothering to close my door properly. I tore out of the gas station, tires squealing. In my rearview mirror, I saw his truck pull out after me. What followed was the most terrifying drive of my life. The lonely highway stretched out before me, dark and foreboding. The manager's truck stayed right on my tail, no matter how fast I drove or how many turns I took. I tried to call 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. And out here, in the middle of nowhere, my signal kept dropping. I was on my own. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost all meaning as I focused on staying ahead, on not letting him catch me. My gas gauge was dropping dangerously low, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw it. A state trooper parked on the side of the road ahead. I've never been so happy to see a cop in my life. I screeched to a halt next to the patrol car, tumbling out of my vehicle before it had even come to a complete stop. The trooper was out of his car in an instant, hand on his weapon. "Please," I gasped, pointing back down the road. "He's after me, the motel manager. He's been following me for miles." But when we looked, the road behind me was empty. The manager's truck was nowhere to be seen. The trooper looked at me skeptically, but as I poured out my story, the hidden camera is the chase. His expression changed to one of concern. He radioed for backup and took my statement, promising to investigate the motel. As I sat in the back of the patrol car, wrapped in a scratchy blanket and sipping lukewarm coffee, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I was safe for now, but the fear lingered, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. In the days that followed, I learned more about the manager. The police raided the motel and found evidence of his crimes. Hidden cameras in several rooms, hours of footage of unsuspecting guests. He was arrested, along with a few accomplices. It turned out to be a larger operation than anyone had suspected. My wallet was recovered, thankfully, but the sense of violation, the knowledge that my most private moments had been captured on film, that wasn't so easily returned. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I see his face in crowds, jump at unexpected noises. I haven't been able to stay in a motel since, and even hotels make me uneasy. I find myself checking for cameras everywhere I go, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. But I'm trying to move forward. I'm in therapy, working through the trauma. I've become an advocate for stricter laws against hidden cameras and for better security in motels and hotels. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about how close I came to being another nameless, faceless victim, and I'm grateful. Grateful that I noticed that tiny red light. Grateful that I trusted my instincts and ran, because now I know the truth. The monsters aren't always hiding under the bed. Sometimes they're behind the front desk, wearing a friendly smile and holding out a room key, and the only defense we have is to stay alert, to trust our gut, and to never, ever ignore that little voice that says something isn't right. So, if you're ever driving down a lonely highway and see a flickering vacancy sign, think twice before you stop. Because you never know who might be watching on the other side of that lens. The apartment complex seemed like any other, all gleaming windows and manicured lawns, but behind one of those pristine doors lurked a darkness I never could have imagined. When I took the job as a security guard, I thought I'd be dealing with rowdy teenagers and noise complaints. I never expected to uncover a human trafficking ring that would shake me to my very core. I'd been working at Sunnyside luxury apartments for about 6 months when it all started. The place was upscale, the kind of joint where residents expected their every whim catered to. My job was simple: patrol the grounds, keep an eye on the security cameras, and make sure the residents felt safe in their million-dollar homes. Most nights were uneventful. I'd make my rounds, nod politely to the late-night dog walkers, and settle in for a long shift of staring at security monitors. But that night, something felt off from the moment I clocked in. It started with Mr. Vargas in apartment 507. He was a quiet guy, kept to himself mostly, but lately I'd noticed him bringing in a lot of people. At first, I thought maybe he was just popular, hosting parties or something, but the people he brought in, they always looked nervous, glancing around like they were afraid of being seen. I was doing my usual check of the camera feeds when I saw Mr. Vargas again. He was leading a young woman into the building. She couldn't have been more than 20, and she looked terrified. My gut twisted as I watched them disappear into the elevator. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was imagining things, but the image of that girl's frightened face stayed with me. I decided to do a walk by of the 5th floor, just to ease my mind. As I approached apartment 507, I heard muffled voices, nothing unusual there, but then I heard what sounded like crying. My hand hovered over my radio, debating whether to call it in. But what would I say? That I had a hunch. I was about to walk away when I heard it. A scream, quickly muffled but unmistakable. My training kicked in, and before I knew it, I was pounding on the door. "Mr. Vargas? Security? Is everything okay in there?" Silence. Then the sound of hurried footsteps. I fumbled for my master key, my heart racing. As I swung the door open, the scene before me froze me in my tracks. The apartment was filled with people, men and women, some barely more than teenagers. They were huddled together, looking at me with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. And there was Mr. Vargas, standing in the middle of it all, his face a mask of rage. "You shouldn't have come in here," he snarled, reaching behind his back. I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. I slammed the door shut and ran, my fingers already dialing 911 on my phone. The next few hours were a blur of police sirens, flashing lights and endless questions. I watched as Mr. Vargas was led away in handcuffs, as the victims were gently escorted out to waiting ambulances. The full horror of what had been happening right under my nose began to sink in. It turned out Mr. Vargas was part of a large human trafficking ring. They'd been using the apartment as a holding place, a stop on a terrible journey for these vulnerable people. The police praised me for trusting my instincts, for acting when I did. But all I could think about was how long it had been going on, how many people had suffered while I patrolled the halls, oblivious. In the days that followed, the story exploded. News vans camped outside the complex, reporters shoving microphones in my face every time I left my apartment. The other residents looked at me differently now, some with gratitude, others with suspicion, as if wondering how I could have let this happen. The apartment complex's management was in damage control mode. They installed new security measures, ran background checks on all residents, and held community meetings to address concerns. But the trust was broken. You could feel it in the air, see it in the way people hurried to their cars, always looking over their shoulders. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of those people in Mr. Vargas's apartment. I kept replaying every interaction I'd ever had with him, wondering how I could have missed the signs. The guilt was overwhelming. About a week after the arrest, I was approached by a woman as I was leaving for my shift. She was small, with haunted eyes that spoke of unimaginable hardship. I recognized her as one of the people from the apartment. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You saved us." I wanted to tell her that I was just doing my job, that anyone would have done the same. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, fighting back tears. That conversation was a turning point for me. I realized that while I couldn't change what had happened, I could make sure it never happened again. Not on my watch. I threw myself into learning everything I could about human trafficking. I attended workshops, spoke to experts, and even started a support group for the other security guards in the area. We shared tips, warning signs to look out for, and ways to build trust with residents so they'd feel comfortable reporting suspicious activity. The apartment complex became a model for security in the area. We implemented new protocols, worked closely with local law enforcement, and made sure every employee was trained to recognize the signs of trafficking. Slowly but surely, the sense of safety began to return. But for me, things would never be the same. Every new resident and every visitor was now a potential threat in my eyes. I knew it wasn't healthy, this constant suspicion, but I couldn't help it. The weight of what I'd seen, what I'd been unknowingly complicit in, was too heavy to shake off. Months passed, and life at Sunnyside luxury apartments settled into a new normal. The news vans left, the reporters found new stories to chase, and most of the residents who'd moved out in the immediate aftermath of the discovery were replaced by new tenants unaware of the building's dark history. But I never forgot. How could I? Every night as I made my rounds, I'd pause outside apartment 507. It was occupied now by a young couple, expecting their first child. They'd painted the walls, replaced the carpets, erased all physical traces of what had happened there. But for me, the echoes of those muffled cries, that desperate scream, still lingered. One night, about a year after the incident, I was on my usual patrol when I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked in the visitor's lot. Nothing unusual about that, but something made me take a closer look. There was a man in the driver's seat, just sitting there, watching the building. My heart rate picked up as I approached the car. "Everything okay, sir?" I asked, shining my flashlight into the vehicle. The man jumped, clearly startled. "Oh, yes, I'm waiting for someone." But his eyes couldn't meet mine, and his hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. It could have been nothing. He could have been telling the truth, but I wasn't taking any chances, not again. I radioed for backup and kept the man talking until the police arrived. It turned out my instincts were right. He was part of the same trafficking ring that Mr. Vargas had worked for. They'd been planning to start up operations in the building again, thinking the heightened security had relaxed. As I watched the police lead him away, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that we'd caught him before he could hurt anyone, pride that our new security measures had worked, but mostly I felt a grim determination. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Human trafficking isn't something that happens in far-off places to people we don't know. It happens right here in our communities, in the buildings we live in and walk past every day. And the only way to fight it is to stay vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to never, ever look the other way. Every night when I put on my uniform and clip on my badge, I remember the faces of those people in apartment 507. I remember the woman who thanked me, her eyes full of a pain I could never fully understand. And I make a silent promise to them and to all the potential victims out there, not here. Not on my watch, never again, because now I know the truth. The monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like your quiet neighbor, the one who always pays his rent on time. And the only defense we have is to keep our eyes open, to listen to that nagging feeling when something doesn't seem right, and to have the courage to act when others might look away. It's a heavy responsibility, but it's one I carry willingly. Because if I can save even one more person from the fate that awaited those in apartment 507, then every sleepless night, every moment of paranoia, will have been worth it. The flickering neon sign promised vacancy, but what awaited me in that rundown motel was far from empty. I thought I was checking into a cheap room for the night. Instead, I had unwittingly stepped into the middle of a criminal operation that would test my will to survive. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion as I navigated the empty highways of rural America. This cross-country road trip was supposed to be my great adventure, a chance to clear my head after losing my job and breaking up with my long-term girlfriend. But 12 hours into the drive, all I wanted was a shower and a bed. The motel appeared like a mirage in the desert of my fatigue. It wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, a parking lot more pothole than pavement. But the vacancy sign was lit, and at that point, I would have slept in a barn. I pulled into the lot, the crunch of gravel under my tires unnaturally loud in the still night air. The office was dimly lit, a single bulb casting more shadows than light. Behind the counter stood a man who looked as weathered as the building itself, his eyes sharp and alert despite the late hour. "Need a room?" I mumbled, fumbling for my wallet. He nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course. How long will you be staying with us?" "Just for the night, hitting the road early tomorrow." He handed me a key, his fingers lingering a moment too long as they brushed against mine. "Room 13, around back. Enjoy your stay." I suppressed a shudder as I headed back to my car. Something about this place felt off, but I was too tired to care. I just needed sleep. Room 13 was exactly what you'd expect from a cheap roadside motel. Faded wallpaper, a bed that creaked when I sat on it, and a bathroom that had seen better days. But it was a roof over my head, and right then, that was all that mattered. I took a quick shower, the water never quite getting hot enough to be comfortable. As I was drying off, I heard voices outside my door, angry voices. I froze, straining to hear. "You idiot. You were supposed to check the plates before assigning a room. Now we've got a random in the middle of everything." "I'm sorry, boss, I didn't think." "That's right. You didn't think. Now we've got to deal with this mess." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it through the door. Deal with this mess. Deal with me. I frantically looked around the room, searching for a way out. The window was small, but I thought I could squeeze through if I had to. Just as I was about to make a break for it, there was a knock at the door. "Hey buddy, sorry to bother you, but we've got a bit of a plumbing issue. Need to move you to another room." I stood there, paralyzed with indecision. If I opened the door, I'd be walking right into their hands, but if I didn't, they'd know something was up. That's okay," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm pretty comfortable here." There was a pause, then the sound of hushed conversation. "Look, man, we're coming in. Don't make this difficult." The door burst open before I could react. 3 men rushed in, 2 of them grabbing my arms while the third, the manager from the front desk, stood watching with cold eyes. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I protested, struggling against the iron grip of the men holding me. "I'm just passing through, I swear." The manager studied me for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. "Check his car," he said finally to one of the men. "If he's telling the truth, we'll find out." As one of the men left to search my car, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I had stumbled into something big, something dangerous, and these men weren't going to let me walk away easily. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, despite the fear coursing through me. "I don't know what's going on here, and I don't want to know. Just let me go, and I swear I won't say a word to anyone." The manager laughed, a harsh sound devoid of any real humor. "Oh, you're not going anywhere. Not until we figure out what to do with you." The man who had searched my car returned, holding my duffel bag. "Nothing suspicious, boss. Looks like he might be telling the truth." The manager frowned, clearly not happy with this development. "Tie him up. We'll decide what to do with him after the shipment comes in." Before I could protest, I was shoved onto the bed, my hands and feet quickly bound with duct tape. A strip was placed over my mouth, muffling my objections. "Sweet dreams," the manager said with a smirk as they left, locking the door behind them. I lay there, my mind racing. What had I gotten myself into? What shipment were they talking about? Drug running? Weapons? Human trafficking? Each possibility seemed worse than the last. Hours passed, marked only by the steady tick of the cheap clock on the nightstand. I worked at my bonds, twisting my wrists until the skin was raw, but the tape held firm. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the threadbare curtains, I heard a commotion outside, trucks pulling in, men shouting orders. This must be the shipment they were waiting for. I renewed my efforts to free myself, desperation giving me strength I didn't know I had. Just as I felt the tape on my wrist begin to give, the door burst open. It was the manager, his face flushed with anger. "Change of plans," he growled, roughly yanking me to my feet. "Buyers got spooked. We're moving out, and you're coming with us." He dragged me outside, where I saw a scene of organized chaos. Men were loading crates into unmarked vans, while others stood guard with weapons poorly concealed under their jackets. My stomach dropped as I realized the scale of the operation I had stumbled into. I was shoved into the back of one of the vans, the door slamming shut behind me. In the dim light, I could make out the shapes of crates surrounding me. What was in them? Drugs? Weapons? I didn't want to know. As the van started moving, I renewed my efforts to free myself. The tape on my wrists was weakened from my earlier struggles, and with a final painful twist, I managed to break free. I quickly removed the tape from my mouth and feet, then began to search for a way out. The van had no windows in the back, but there was a small partition separating the cargo area from the cab. Through it, I could hear the manager and another man talking. "What are we going to do with him?" the other man asked. "We'll take him to the secondary location," the manager replied. "Once everything's secured, we'll decide whether he's more valuable alive or dead." A chill ran down my spine at his casual discussion of my fate. I had to get out of here, and fast. I began to feel around the crates, hoping to find something I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around something cold and metallic, a crowbar, probably used for opening the crates. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The van hit a bump, and I heard something shift in one of the crates. A muffled sound followed. A cry. With growing horror, I realized what kind of shipment I was trapped with. There was no more time for hesitation. I gripped the crowbar tightly and moved towards the partition. It was now or never. With all my strength, I swung the crowbar at the partition, shattering it. The driver swerved in surprise, nearly sending us off the road. In the confusion, I lunged forward, swinging wildly at anyone within reach. The van screeched to a halt, and for a few chaotic moments, it was all fists and shouts and the metallic clang of the crowbar. I fought with a desperation I had never known, driven by the twin forces of survival and the need to stop whatever horrific operation I had uncovered. Somehow, I found myself outside the van, running down an unfamiliar road. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. I ran like I had never run before, my lungs burning, my legs pushing past the point of exhaustion. I don't know how long I ran, or how far. All I know is that eventually I saw lights ahead, a gas station, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I burst through the doors, gasping for breath, and managed to choke out a plea to call the police before collapsing. The next few hours were a blur of police sirens, paramedics, and endless questions. As the adrenaline wore off, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. I had narrowly escaped death, yes, but I had also uncovered a human trafficking operation. The crates in that van hadn't been filled with drugs or weapons, but with people. People who, if I hadn't escaped when I did, might have been lost forever. In the days that followed, as I gave statements to the police and tried to process my trauma, I couldn't shake the memory of that muffled cry from the crate. How many other victims were out there? How many other seemingly innocent motels were fronts for such horrific operations? I knew then that my life would never be the same. This wasn't something I could simply move on from. I had seen behind the curtain, glimpsed the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our world, and now that I knew, I couldn't look away. As I sit here now, months later, I still jump at unexpected noises. I still can't stay in motels, but I've also found a new purpose. I've connected with organizations that fight human trafficking, sharing my story and helping to raise awareness. It's not much, but it's a start, because now I know the truth. The real monsters aren't hiding under the bed. They're running the front desk, offering you a room key with a smile, and the only way to fight them is to stay vigilant, to trust your instincts, and to never, ever look away from the darkness, no matter how tempting it might be. So the next time you see a flickering vacancy sign on a lonely stretch of highway, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the real danger isn't in what you can see, but in what's hiding just out of sight. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one to shine a light into that darkness and help bring it to an end. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow across the empty gas station. I never thought a minimum wage job could turn into a fight for survival. But as I stared into the cold, determined eyes of the man holding a knife to my throat, I realized how quickly an ordinary night could spiral into terror. I'd been working the graveyard shift at Ed's Gas and Go for about 3 months. It wasn't glamorous work, but it did the job. I paid the bills while I figured out what to do with my life after dropping out of college. Most nights were uneventful, restocking shelves, mopping floors, and ringing up the occasional insomniac or trucker passing through our small Nevada town. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., nodding goodbye to Jake, the evening shift guy, as he practically ran out the door. I settled in behind the counter, pulled out my textbook. I was trying to teach myself coding and prepared for another long, quiet night. The first few hours passed in a blur of coffee and JavaScript tutorials. Around 2 a.m., I decided to do a quick inventory check, more to stretch my legs than out of any real necessity. As I was counting energy drinks in the cooler, I heard the bell above the door chime. I poked my head out from behind the shelves, my customer service smile already plastered on. "Welcome to Ed's. Let me know if you need any help." The man who had walked in didn't respond. He was tall, probably in his late 30s, with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were wild, darting around the store like a cornered animal. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed it aside. You can't judge a book by its cover, right? I made my way back to the counter, keeping an eye on him as he wandered the aisles. "Anything I can help you find?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to look at me, and in that moment, I knew I was in trouble. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You can help me by emptying that register." My heart started pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. I glanced at the panic button under the counter, wondering if I could reach it without him noticing. As if reading my mind, he pulled out a knife, the blade glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Don't even think about it," he growled. "Just give me the money and nobody gets hurt." My hands were shaking as I opened the register. "Look, man, there's not much here. We don't keep a lot of cash on hand, especially overnight." His face twisted with rage. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, slamming his fist on the counter. "I know you've got more. Where is it?" "I'm not lying," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is all we have, please, just take it and go." For a moment I thought he might actually leave. But then his eyes narrowed, and he vaulted over the counter with surprising agility. Before I could react, he had me pinned against the wall, the knife pressed against my throat. "Listen, you little shit," he hissed, his breath hot on my face. "I'm not playing games here. You're going to show me where the real money is, or things are going to get real ugly, real fast." My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I could feel the cold steel of the blade against my skin, knew that one wrong move could end with my blood spilled across the linoleum floor. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "There's a safe in the back office, I'll show you." He grabbed my arm, twisting it behind my back, and shoved me towards the office. As we walked, I frantically tried to think of a plan. The safe was real, but I didn't know the combination. Ed, the owner, was the only one who could open it. When we got there and I couldn't open it, what would this guy do? We reached the office, and I fumbled with the keys, buying time. "It's in here," I said, pointing to the safe in the corner. "But I don't know the combination. Only the owner can open it." His grip on my arm tightened painfully. "You expect me to believe that? Open it. Now." "I can't," I insisted. "I swear I don't know the combination." "Look, I'll call the owner. He can come open it for you." It was a desperate gamble. I didn't think Ed would actually come. He was notoriously cheap and probably wouldn't risk his life for the couple $100 in the safe. But maybe, just maybe, he'd call the cops instead. The man considered for a moment, then nodded. "Fine, call him, but no tricks or you'll regret it." With shaking hands, I dialed Ed's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Come on, Ed, pick up." On the 5th ring, A groggy voice answered. "This better be good." "Ed," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's Sarah from the night shift. We've got a situation here. A customer needs you to come open the safe." There was a pause on the other end. I prayed Ed would pick up on the code we'd established for emergencies. Customer needs the safe opened meant call the police immediately. "I see," Ed said slowly. "Tell the customer I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead, and I turned back to the man with the knife. "He's on his way. Should be here in about 20 minutes. The man growled in frustration. "We don't have 20 minutes. You're lying to me, aren't you? There is no owner coming." "You're stalling." He lunged at me, grabbing my hair and yanking my head back. The knife was at my throat again, pressing harder this time. I could feel a warm trickle of blood where the blade bit into my skin. "Please," I gasped. "I'm telling the truth." "He's coming. Just give him time." The next 15 minutes were the longest of my life. The man paced the small office like a caged animal, alternating between muttering to himself and hurling threats at me. I sat in the corner, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying that help would arrive before he lost what little control he had left. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, we heard it, the distant wail of police sirens. The man's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "You bitch," he snarled, lunging at me again. "You called the cops." I scrambled backwards, but there was nowhere to go in the tiny office. He grabbed me, spinning me around and wrapping his arm around my neck in a chokehold. The knife pressed against my cheek, and I could feel the sting as it cut into my skin. "You're my ticket out of here," he growled in my ear. "Try anything, and I'll cut you open right here." He dragged me out of the office, using me as a human shield as we made our way back to the front of the store. Through the windows, I could see police cars pulling into the parking lot, their lights painting the gas station in surreal flashes of red and blue. "Let her go," a voice boomed through a megaphone. "We have the building surrounded. Come out with your hands up." The man's grip tightened, the knife pressing harder against my face. "Not a chance," he shouted back. "I'm walking out of here, or the girl dies." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. This was it. This was how I was going to die, in a gas station in the middle of nowhere, all because I took a stupid night shift job to pay the bills. But then, something inside me snapped. A surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins, and in that moment, I decided I wasn't going to be a victim. I wasn't going to die here. With all the strength I could muster, I slammed my elbow back into the man's solar plexus. He let out a whoosh of air, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench free. I spun around, bringing my knee up hard between his legs. He doubled over, the knife clattering to the ground. I kicked it away and ran, my legs carrying me towards the door faster than I'd ever moved in my life. I burst out of the gas station, hands raised, screaming, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" The police swarmed around me, pulling me to safety as more officers rushed in to subdue the man. The next few hours passed in a blur of paramedics, police statements, and phone calls to my frantic parents. By the time the sun rose, painting the desert sky in shades of pink and gold, it was all over. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, I watched them lead the man away in handcuffs. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something there I hadn't before. Desperation, yes, but also a profound sadness. In that moment, I realized that the line between ordinary life and extraordinary terror is thinner than we'd like to believe. One decision, one moment of desperation can change everything. I quit my job at the gas station that day, but the experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I went back to school, switched my major to criminal justice. Now I'm working towards becoming a crisis counselor, hoping to help people before they reach that point of desperation. Because now I know the truth. The real monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. They're the ones walking among us, pushed to the edge by circumstances we may never fully understand. And sometimes, the only thing standing between order and chaos is one person's choice to be brave in the face of terror. So the next time you stop at a gas station in the middle of the night, spare a thought for the person behind the counter. You never know what battles they might be fighting, what courage they might be called upon to show, because in this world, heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear name tags and work the graveyard shift. The sound of shattering glass pierced the air, and in that moment, I knew our carefree road trip had taken a sinister turn. What started as an overheard conversation in a dingy diner became a desperate fight for survival, with 4 friends running for their lives through the backwoods of America. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. Me, my best friend Mark, and our girlfriends Sarah and Lisa had planned this cross-country road trip for months. We were all in our early 22s, fresh out of college, ready to see the world before settling into the monotony of adult life. The plan was simple. Drive from New York to California, stopping at every quirky roadside attraction and hole-in-the-wall diner along the way. We were about a week into our journey when it happened. We'd been driving for hours through what felt like an endless expanse of cornfields in the Midwest. It was late. We were all exhausted and starving when we spotted a small diner just off the highway. The neon sign flickered weakly, promising Mom's home cooking and best pie in the state. The place was nearly empty when we walked in. Just a couple of truckers at the counter and an old man nursing a coffee in a corner booth. We slid into a booth near the back, the vinyl seats squeaking under our weight. A tired-looking waitress took our orders, and we settled in, grateful for the chance to stretch our legs. I was halfway through my burger when I noticed them. 2 men had entered the diner, taking seats at the counter. There was something off about them, an intensity in their eyes that set my teeth on edge. I tried to shake it off, tell myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't help but keep glancing their way. That's when I heard it. The men were talking in low voices, but in the quiet of the nearly empty diner, their words carried, "Won't find the bodies for weeks," one of them said, a smirk evident in his voice. We made sure of that. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. I caught Mark's eye across the table, and I knew he'd heard it too. Sarah and Lisa were engrossed in conversation, oblivious to the chilling words that had just floated our way. "We need to be careful," the other man replied. "If anyone saw us, we're done for." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the diner could hear it. I tried to act normal, to continue eating as if I hadn't just overheard what sounded like 2 men discussing murder. But my hands were shaking, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Mark leaned across the table, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here, now." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady as I addressed the girls. "Hey, I'm not feeling great. Think we could hit the road?" Sarah looked at me, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay? You look pale." "Yeah, just something's not sitting right." "Probably just road fatigue." Let's go, yeah? We paid our bill and headed for the door, trying not to look rushed. As we passed the two men at the counter, I could feel their eyes on us. My skin crawled, and it took every ounce of willpower not to break into a run. We made it to the car, and Mark peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind us. Only when the diner had disappeared from view did I let out the breath I'd been holding. "Okay, what the hell was that about?" Lisa demanded from the back seat. Mark and I exchanged glances, and I filled the girls in on what we'd overheard. As I spoke, I watched their faces change from skepticism to horror. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "Should we call the police?" I was about to agree when Mark's sharp intake of breath caught my attention. "Guys," he said, his voice tight. "We've got company." I turned to look out the rear window, and my blood ran cold. A truck was bearing down on us, its headlights flooding our car with harsh light. Even from this distance, I could make out the two figures in the cab. "It's them," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They must have realized we overheard them. Mark pressed down on the accelerator, the old car groaning in protest as he pushed it to its limits. But the truck behind us was gaining, its engine far more powerful than our beat-up sedan. "There's a turnoff coming up," Lisa said, her voice shaking as she consulted the map. "It leads into the woods. Maybe we can lose them." Mark didn't hesitate. He yanked the wheel hard, and we swerved onto the dirt road. Trees loomed on either side, branches scraping against the car as we hurtled down the narrow path. For a moment, I thought we'd lost them. But then I heard it, the roar of an engine, the crunch of gravel. They were still behind us. "Shit!" Mark yelled, swerving to avoid a fallen log. The car fishtailed, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought we were going to flip. But Mark managed to regain control, though we'd lost precious speed in the process. The truck was right behind us now. I could see the men's faces twisted with rage in the rearview mirror. One of them leaned out the window, something glinting in his hand. "Get down!" I screamed, just as the first shot rang out. Glass shattered as the bullet struck our rear window. Sarah screamed, and I felt a stinging pain as shards rained down on us. Mark was weaving back and forth, trying to present a harder target. But on the narrow road, there wasn't much room to maneuver. Another shot rang out, this one puncturing our rear tire. The car lurched, and Mark fought to keep it on the road. "We can't outrun them," he yelled over the noise of the flapping tire. "We need to ditch the car and run." It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. Up ahead, I could see a thicket of trees, dense enough that the truck wouldn't be able to follow. "There," I pointed. "We can lose them in there." Mark nodded grimly and aimed the car for the thicket. "When I say go, everyone out. Run as fast as you can and don't look back." We were almost there. I could hear the men shouting behind us, the truck's engine roaring as they tried to close the last bit of distance. "Now!" Mark yelled. We burst out of the car, adrenaline pushing us faster than I thought possible. I could hear the crash as our car plowed into the trees, the screech of brakes as the truck skidded to a stop. We ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. I could hear shouting behind us, but it was getting fainter. We were putting distance between us and our pursuers. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we stumbled into a small clearing. We all collapsed, gasping for breath, I think. I think we lost them," Lisa panted, but even as the words left her mouth, we heard it. Voices, faint but getting closer, and worse, dogs. They'd brought dogs. "We need to keep moving," I said, forcing myself to my feet, despite the protest of my burning muscles. We set off again, slower this time, trying to be quieter. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, each tree indistinguishable from the last. We were hopelessly lost, but being lost was better than being found by those men. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, we finally heard something that wasn't the baying of dogs or the shouts of our pursuers. Traffic, a highway. We stumbled out of the woods onto the shoulder of a busy interstate. Cars whizzed by, their drivers oblivious to the nightmare we'd just lived through. Mark managed to flag down a state trooper, and soon we were sitting in the back of his cruiser, blankets draped over our shoulders, trying to explain our wild tale. To his credit, the trooper took us seriously. He called for backup, and soon the woods were swarming with police eyeing, searching for any sign of the men who had chased us. They found our car, smashed against the trees, and the truck abandoned nearby. But of the two men, there was no sign. They had vanished into the woods like ghosts. In the days that followed, as we gave statements and tried to process what had happened, the full weight of it all began to sink in. We had stumbled upon something dark, something deadly, and only by sheer luck had we escaped with our lives. Our carefree road trip was over. We flew back home, too shaken to continue the journey, but the experience changed us, bonded us in a way that went beyond normal friendship. We had faced death together and come out the other side. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the crack of gunshots, still feel the sting of branches whipping my face as we ran for our lives. I know the others do too. We don't talk about it much, but it's there in the way we hug each other a little tighter when we meet, in the understanding looks we share when someone mentions taking a road trip. Because now we know the truth, that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, that a simple stop at a roadside diner can turn into a fight for survival. And we know that when faced with that evil, you have two choices: run or stand and fight. That night in the woods, we chose to run, but the experience taught us that we're stronger than we ever knew, capable of facing terrors we never imagined. So if you're ever on a long drive, and you see a dingy little diner on the side of the road, think twice before you stop. Because you never know what conversations you might overhear, what dark secrets might be revealed. And sometimes it's better to stay hungry than to risk becoming someone else's secret to keep. The attic door creaked open, revealing a nightmare I never could have imagined. In that moment, I realized that the charming small town and the friendly landlord were facades, hiding a darkness that would forever change my life. I moved to Millbrook, a quaint little town in rural Ohio, seeking a fresh start after my divorce. The place seemed perfect, picturesque streets lined with maple trees, friendly faces at every turn, and a sense of community I'd been missing in the big city. When I found a cozy little house for rent at a surprisingly affordable price, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Mr. Peterson, my landlord, was the epitome of small-town charm. A man in his late 60s with a grandfatherly demeanor, he welcomed me to the neighborhood with a homemade apple pie and offers to help with any repairs or odd jobs around the house. I felt lucky to have found such a kind landlord, especially being new in town. The first few weeks were idyllic. I settled into my job at the local library, made a few friends, and started to feel like Millbrook could really be home. Mr. Peterson would often stop by, checking if I needed anything or just to chat. His attention was a bit much at times, but I chalked it up to small-town friendliness. It was about a month into my stay when things started to feel off. I'd come home to find things slightly out of place, a book on a different shelf, a mug in the wrong cabinet. At first, I dismissed it as my own forgetfulness, but then I started to feel like I was being watched. I'd be reading in the living room and get a prickly feeling on the back of my neck, as if someone's eyes were on me. I'd whirl around, but there was never anyone there. At night, I'd wake up to the sound of creaking floorboards, only to find the house empty when I investigated. One afternoon, I came home early from work with a migraine. As I approached the house, I could have sworn I saw a curtain twitch, as if someone inside had been watching for me and ducked away. But when I entered, the house was silent and still. That night, unable to shake my unease, I decided to do a thorough check of the house. Everything seemed normal until I got to the hallway closet. There, hidden behind some old coats, I found a small door I'd never noticed before. It was locked, but something about it made my skin crawl. I called Mr. Peterson the next day, trying to keep my voice casual as I asked about the door. "Oh, that old thing," he said with a chuckle. "It's just access to some old plumbing." "Nothing to worry about, dear." His explanation made sense, but it didn't settle the knot in my stomach. That night, I lay awake, listening, and there it was again, the soft creak of floorboards, too deliberate to be the house settling. Heart pounding, I crept out of bed and followed the sound. It was coming from above me, the attic. I'd never been up there, had assumed it was just storage space. With shaking hands, I pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. What I saw there stopped my heart. One corner of the attic had been turned into a living space with a small cot, a mini fridge, and piles of newspapers. But it was the walls that made me feel faint. They were covered, every inch, with photos. Photos of me getting the mail, me reading on the porch, me sleeping in my bed. Hundreds of images documenting every moment of my life in this house. And in the center of it all, a shrine-like space with candles and a large portrait of me, clearly taken from my social media before I'd made everything private. I must have made a sound, a whimper of terror, because suddenly there was movement in the shadows. Mr. Peterson emerged, his kind face now twisted into something unrecognizable. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not yet. I had such plans for us, my dear." I ran, scrambling down the ladder. My only thought was to get out, get away. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy on the attic stairs. I made it to the front door, fumbling with the locks with shaking hands. Just as I wrenched the door open, I felt his hand close around my arm. "You can't leave," he growled. "You're mine. You've always been mine." I don't remember consciously deciding to fight. One moment I was frozen in terror, and the next I was swinging, my fist connecting with his jaw with a sickening crack. He stumbled back, surprised by my sudden resistance, and then I seized the opportunity to run. The cool night air hit me like a slap as I burst out of the house. I ran blindly, barefoot in my pajamas, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from there. I could hear him behind me, calling my name in a twisted parody of concern. I ended up at the police station, gasping and sobbing as I tried to explain what had happened. The officers were skeptical at first. Mr. Peterson was a respected member of the community after all, but when they went to investigate, they couldn't ignore the evidence. The attic was just as I'd described, a terrifying monument to obsession, but it was worse than I'd realized in my panicked state. They found journals detailing his plans for me, for us. He'd been watching me long before I moved to Millbrook, had orchestrated my arrival here, the house, the job, even my divorce. He'd had a hand in all of it, manipulating events from afar to bring me into his web. As the investigation unfolded, more horrifying details emerged. I wasn't the first, there had been others, women who had disappeared over the years. The attic contained trophies from each of them, lives cut short by a monster hiding behind a grandfatherly smile. Mr. Peterson was arrested, but the damage was done. My sense of safety, of trust, had been shattered. The quaint little town now felt suffocating, every friendly face a potential mask for darker intentions. I couldn't stay in Millbrook, couldn't bear to walk the streets where everyone now looked at me with a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. I packed up and left, driving until the town was just a speck in my rearview mirror. It's been years now, and I've built a new life in a big city where anonymity is a blessing. I've been through therapy, worked to rebuild my sense of security, but some scars don't fade. I still check my locks 3 times before bed. Still feel a chill run down my spine when I catch someone looking at me for too long. Still wake up sometimes, heart racing, sure that I can hear footsteps in the attic. The experience changed me, made me warier, more cautious, but it also showed me my own strength. I had faced true evil, looked it in the eye, and survived. I had fought back when it mattered most. Sometimes I think about the other women, the ones who didn't escape. I wonder if they fought too, if they had moments of hope before the end. It's a heavy burden, being the one who got away, but I carry it, for them, and for myself. I've learned that evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. It can hide behind kind smiles and apple pies, can lurk in the most picturesque of places. The monsters aren't always strangers lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they're the friendly neighbor, the helpful landlord, the pillar of the community. But I've also learned that there's strength in survival, in refusing to let the darkness win. Each day I live fully, freely, is a victory. Each moment of joy, of peace, is a middle finger to the man who thought he could own me. So if you're ever in a small town and everything seems just a little too dark, if you feel too perfect, remember my story. Look beyond the charming facades and friendly smiles. Trust your instincts when something feels off, and if you find yourself in that attic, facing your own monster, know that you're stronger than you think. Fight, run, survive. Because the world needs to know that behind every perfect small-town postcard, there might be an attic full of horrors, and it needs to know that even in the face of such evil, the human spirit can triumph, that sometimes the ones who are meant to be victims become warriors instead. And to Mr. Peterson rotting in his cell, I have just one thing to say. I'm not yours. I never was. And I never will be. My life is my own, and no amount of manipulation or obsession can change that. You tried to break me, but instead, you made me unbreakable. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the empty factory, and in that moment I knew my mundane night shift had twisted into a nightmare. What I'd stumbled upon wasn't just corporate espionage. It was a conspiracy that would test my courage, my morals, and my will to survive. I never wanted to work the night shift at the remote plant. but bills needed paying, and beggars can't be choosers. The job was simple enough: monitor the systems, do routine checks, and make sure nothing went wrong in the dead of night. It was mind-numbingly boring most of the time, but it paid the bills. The plant itself was a maze of machinery, pipes, and control rooms. Most of it was automated, with only a skeleton crew needed to keep things running smoothly. During the day it hummed with activity, but at night it was eerily quiet, the machines casting long shadows in the dim emergency lighting. I'd been doing this job for about 3 months when it happened. It was a particularly cold night in November, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you long for a warm fire and a hot cup of coffee. I was about halfway through my shift, doing my usual rounds, and when I heard it, voices. At first I thought I was imagining things. The plant played tricks on you at night. The hiss of steam could sound like whispers, and the clanking of cooling metal could mimic footsteps, but as I stood there straining my ears, I realized these were definitely human voices. My heart started to race. In all my time working here, I'd never encountered anyone during my rounds. The night shift was a solitary job, just me and the humming machines. I should have called it in right then. Should have radioed for backup or even called the cops, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate, figuring it was probably just some employees working late on a project. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. As I got closer, I could make out words, fragments of conversation. They were arguing about something, their voices tense and angry. I rounded a corner and froze. There, huddled around one of the main control panels, were 3 of my co-workers. I recognized Tom from IT, Sarah from operations, and to my shock, Mr. Johnson, the plant manager himself. They were hunched over a laptop, frantically typing commands into the system. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, and warning lights were flashing on the control panel. "Hurry up," Mr. Johnson hissed. "We need to upload the virus before the system does its automatic reset at 3 a.m. My blood ran cold. A virus. What the hell were they doing? Sarah's fingers flew over the keyboard. Almost there. Once this is in, it'll look like a catastrophic system failure. The company will lose millions, and no one will be the wiser. I must have made a sound, a gasp of shock perhaps, because suddenly all 3 heads snapped up, their eyes locking onto me. For a moment, we all just stared at each other, equally surprised. Then Mr. Johnson's face twisted into a mask of rage. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, taking a step towards me. I held up my hands, trying to look non-threatening. "I'm just the night shift guy," I said, my voice shakier than I would have liked. "I was doing my rounds." I didn't mean to interrupt anything. Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "The night shift guy," he repeated slowly. Of course, I forgot they'd hired someone new for that. He exchanged a look with Tom and Sarah, a silent communication passing between them. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. "Well," Mr. Johnson said, his voice deceptively calm. "Since you're here, why don't you join us? We could use an extra pair of hands." I took a step back, suddenly very aware of how isolated we were in this part of the plant. "I don't think so," I said. "I should really get back to my rounds. I'll just pretend I didn't see anything, okay?" But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The look in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. They couldn't let me leave, not now that I knew what they were up to. Mr. Johnson's fake smile dropped, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "I'm afraid that's not an option," he said. "You see, we've worked too hard and come too far to let some minimum wage night watchman ruin everything." He nodded to Tom, who reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. My heart nearly stopped at the sight of it. "Now," Mr. Johnson continued, "you're going to help us finish this job. And then we're going to have a little chat about your future with the company. Or should I say, your lack of one?" My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I was outnumbered, outgunned, and in way over my head. But I knew I couldn't just go along with their plan. Whatever they were doing, it was going to hurt a lot of people. I couldn't be a part of that. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'll help. What do you need me to do?" Mr. Johnson seemed to relax slightly, though Tom kept the gun trained on me. "Smart choice," he said. "Sarah will tell you what to input. Don't try anything stupid." I moved to the control panel, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for the keyboard. Sarah started rattling off a series of commands for me to enter. As I typed, I tried to make sense of what I was seeing on the screen. It was complex stuff, way above my pay grade, but I could tell it was bad, really bad. As I worked, I kept one eye on the others. Mr. Johnson was pacing nervously, checking his watch every few seconds. Tom's attention was divided between watching me and keeping an eye on the entrance to the room. Sarah was focused entirely on the laptop, her fingers flying over the keys. That's when I saw my chance. There was an emergency alarm button under the control panel, designed to alert authorities in case of a major incident. If I could just reach it without them noticing, I pretended to drop something, bending down quickly. My fingers found the button, and I pressed it hard, praying it would work silently. For a moment, nothing happened. I straightened up, trying to act normal, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the plant. Red lights flashed, and a computerized voice announced a facility-wide emergency. Chaos erupted. Mr. Johnson started shouting. Sarah frantically tried to abort whatever she was doing on the computer, and Tom swung the gun wildly, unsure where to point it. In the confusion, I made my move. I shoved the control panel hard, sending it crashing into Tom. The gun went off, the shot going wide and shattering a nearby glass partition. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran like I'd never run before. Alarms blaring in my ears, red lights casting eerie shadows as I tore through the plant. I could hear shouting behind me, footsteps pounding on the metal walkways. I'd burst out of a side door into the cold night air, gulping it down in great gasps. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching. Help was coming, but I wasn't safe yet. I sprinted across the parking lot, heading for the woods that bordered the plant. Just as I reached the tree line, I heard a shot ring out. Something hot whizzed past my ear, and I dove into the underbrush. I crawled through the woods, branches scratching my face, my clothes catching on thorns. I could hear them crashing through the trees behind me, shouting to each other as they searched. I don't know how long I ran, or how far. All I know is that eventually I broke through the trees onto a road. A police car was just pulling up, responding to the alarm. I've never been so happy to see flashing lights in my life. The next few hours were a blur of questions, statements, and disbelief. The police raided the plant, catching Sarah and Tom, though Mr. Johnson managed to slip away in the chaos. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders. I watched as Sarah and Tom were led away in handcuffs, and I couldn't help but wonder how people I had worked with, joked with, shared lunch breaks with, could have been involved in something so sinister. In the days that followed, the full scope of the conspiracy came to light. It wasn't just corporate sabotage, it was industrial terrorism on a massive scale. The virus they were trying to upload would have caused catastrophic failures in plants across the country, potentially putting thousands of lives at risk. I was hailed as a hero, but I didn't feel like one. I felt scared, violated, and unsure who to trust. The plant was shut down pending a full investigation, and I found myself out of a job. But compared to what could have happened, unemployment seemed a small price to pay. It's been months now, and I still jump at unexpected noises. I still look over my shoulder, half expecting to see Mr. Johnson's face in the crowd. The authorities never caught him, and sometimes I wonder if he's out there planning his next move. But I also feel stronger, in a way. I faced true evil that night, stood up against it when it would have been easier to look the other way, and in doing so, I discovered a courage I never knew I had. So if you ever find yourself working a lonely night shift, pay attention to those little things that seem off. Trust your instincts, because sometimes the real danger isn't in the shadows or the dark corners. Sometimes it's right there in the bright lights of the control room, wearing a familiar face and a company ID badge. And when you uncover that danger, when you're faced with the choice to act or to look away, remember this: courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and acting anyway, because in that moment, your actions might just be the thing that stands between order and chaos, between safety and catastrophe. In the end, that's what I hold on to. Not the fear or the trauma, but the knowledge that when it mattered most, I made the right choice. And that's something no conspiracy can ever take away from me. The crackle of the campfire was supposed to be soothing, but as night fell and menacing figures emerged from the shadows, it became a beacon of terror. Our peaceful camping trip had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with us as the prey. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for months. My 3 best friends and I had planned it as a last hurrah before we all went our separate ways for college. We chose a remote spot in the Ozarks, far from the usual crowded campgrounds. We wanted solitude, adventure, and a chance to connect with nature. We had no idea that our desire for isolation would nearly cost us our lives. The first day was perfect. We hiked, swam in a crystal clear stream, and set up our campsite in a picturesque clearing. As night fell, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing our hopes and fears about the future. The stars were impossibly bright, and the forest around us was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. It was as I was dozing off in my tent that I first heard it. Voices carried on the night wind. At first I thought I was dreaming, but as I became more alert, I realized they were real, and they were getting closer. I unzipped the tent and peered out. In the dim moonlight, I could make out several figures moving through the trees towards our campsite. My heart began to race. We were miles from the nearest town, and these weren't the sounds of friendly hikers. I quickly woke the others, whispering urgently about what I'd seen. We huddled in my tent, unsure of what to do. Should we call out, pretend to be asleep, try to leave? Before we could decide, harsh flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating our tents. A gruff voice called out, "We know you're in there. Come out, nice and easy." Exchanging terrified glances, we slowly emerged from the tent. 5 men stood before us, their faces hard and unwelcoming. They were dressed in a mix of camouflage and dirty clothing, and I could see the glint of weapons at their sides. "Well, well," said the one who seemed to be the leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard. "What do we have here? Some city kids playing camping?" "We don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're just here for a few days, then we'll be gone." The man's eyes narrowed. "This is our land. We don't take kindly to trespassers." "We didn't know." My friend Sarah spoke up. "There weren't any signs. We can leave right now if you want." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Leave? Oh no, sweetheart, you're not going anywhere." It was then that the reality of our situation truly sank in. These weren't just unfriendly locals. These were dangerous men, and we were completely at their mercy. The next few hours were a nightmare. They ransacked our campsite, taking anything of value. They taunted us, making veiled threats about what they might do to us. We were forced to sit by the fire, watched closely by 2 of the men while the others continued to search the area. I tried to stay calm, to think of a way out of this. But every time I moved, every time I opened my mouth to speak, one of our captors would bark at me to stay still and shut up. As dawn began to break, I overheard 2 of the men talking in low voices. "We can't let them go," one said. "They've seen our faces. They could identify us." "So what do you suggest?" the other replied. "We can't exactly keep them here forever." There was a long pause before the first man spoke again, his voice chilling in its casualness. "We take them deeper into the woods. Make it look like an accident. City kids get lost all the time out here." My blood ran cold. They were planning to kill us. I caught Sarah's eye, and I could see she'd heard it too. We had to act, and we had to act now. I leaned over to Mark, whispering as quietly as I could. On my signal, "Run. Don't look back. Just run." He nodded, almost imperceptibly. Then passed the message to Jake. I waited, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The leader was distracted, arguing with one of his men about what to do next. The 2 guarding us were looking bored, their attention wandering. This was our chance. "Now!" I yelled, jumping to my feet and kicking our campfire towards the nearest guard. Embers and burning logs scattered, catching him off guard. We ran. I've never run so fast in my life. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step. But I didn't slow down. I could hear shouting behind us, then the terrifying sound of gunshots. We ran blindly through the pre-dawn forest, no idea where we were going, only knowing we had to get away, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. We paused, gasping for breath, trying to listen for sounds of pursuit. "Is everyone okay?" I panted, looking around at my friends. They nodded, wide-eyed and terrified. That's when I realized Sarah wasn't with us. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. In our panic, we'd gotten separated. Sarah was out there alone, possibly hurt, with those maniacs after her. "We have to go back for her," I said. Jake looked at me like I was crazy. Are you insane? They'll kill us. They'll kill Sarah if we don't help her, I shot back. We can't just leave her. In the end, we compromised. Mark would try to find his way back to civilization and get help, while Jake and I went back to look for Sarah. We moved as quietly as we could through the woods, every snapping twig making us jump. As we got closer to our campsite, we could hear voices, angry shouting, things being thrown around. Then we heard a scream, Sarah's scream. Without thinking, I burst from our hiding spot. Jake, right behind me. Sarah was there, being held by one of the men, a knife at her throat. "Let her go," I yelled, grabbing a fallen branch and brandishing it like a weapon. The leader turned, surprise turning to anger on his face. "You just made a big mistake, boy," he growled, pulling out a gun. Time seemed to slow down. I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. I saw Sarah's eyes widen in terror. I saw Jake moving, faster than I'd ever seen him move. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the quiet forest. But it was the leader who fell, tackled by Jake at the last second. The bullet went wide, splintering a tree trunk. Chaos erupted. Sarah stomped on her captor's foot and broke free. I swung my branch, connecting with another man's head with a sickening thud. We fought with a desperation I didn't know we possessed. These men were bigger, stronger, and armed, but we had surprise on our side, and a burning will to survive somehow. In the melee, we managed to get our hands on one of their guns. The tables turned quickly after that. We held them at bay, our hands shaking but our resolve firm. That's how the police found us hours later, led by Mark and a search and rescue team. 4 terrified teenagers holding 5 grown men at gunpoint in a destroyed campsite. The aftermath was a blur of police statements, hospital checks, and tearful reunions with our families. We learned that the men were part of a backwoods militia group responsible for a string of robberies and assaults in the area. They'd been using the remote woods as their hideout for months. It's been years since that camping trip, but the memories are still vivid. I still wake up sometimes, heart racing, sure that I can hear footsteps outside my tent. I can't look at a campfire without remembering the terror of that night. But I also remember the strength we found in ourselves and in each other. We faced true evil and came out the other side, not unscathed, but alive and stronger for it. We don't go camping anymore, the 4 of us, but we're still close, bonded by an experience that no one else can truly understand. And when life gets tough, when we face challenges that seem insurmountable, we remind each other of that night in the woods. If we could survive that, we can survive anything. So if you're ever camping in a remote area and you hear voices in the night, trust your instincts. Sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed or in your closet. Sometimes, they're the ones emerging from the shadows of the forest, wearing camouflage and carrying guns. But remember this too. Courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and acting anyway. It means standing by your friends when every instinct is screaming at you to run. Because in those moments of terror and desperation, you might just discover a strength you never knew you had. And that discovery, it's worth more than any camping trip, any adventure. It's the kind of thing that stays with you for life. A secret strength you can draw on when you need it most. So here's to friendship, to courage, and to the indomitable human spirit. May it always burn brighter than any campfire and guide us through even the darkest of nights. The phone rang. shattering the late-night silence of the 911 dispatch center. I answered with my usual calm professionalism, but the voice on the other end sent chills down my spine. "I can see you," it said, and in that moment, my world shifted on its axis. The hunter had become the hunted, and I was trapped in my own personal nightmare. I'd been working as a 911 dispatcher in the small town of Millbrook, Idaho, for about 3 years. It was a job I loved, despite the long hours and often stressful situations. There was something deeply satisfying about being the calm voice in someone's moment of crisis, about knowing that I was often the difference between life and death. The night shift was usually quiet. Millbrook wasn't exactly a hotbed of crime or emergency. Most calls were about noise complaints, the occasional fender bender, or sometimes a barn fire during the dry season. I'd settled into my usual routine, coffee at my elbow, headset on, monitors glowing softly in the dimly lit room. It was around 1 a.m. when the call came in. I answered with my standard greeting. 911, what's your emergency? There was silence for a moment, then a man's voice, low and eerily calm, said those words that would haunt me for months to come. "I can see you." I felt a chill run down my spine, but years of training kicked in. Keep them talking, get information, trace the call if possible. "Sir, can you clarify what you mean? Are you in danger?" A soft chuckle came through the line. "No danger for me, Sarah, but you might want to check your locks." My blood ran cold. He knew my name. How did he know my name? I glanced around the empty dispatch center, suddenly acutely aware of how isolated I was. "Sir, this line is for emergencies only. If you're not in need of assistance, I'll have to disconnect the call." "Oh, but I am in need of assistance, Sarah," he said, his voice taking on a sing-song quality that made my skin crawl. "I need you to understand how long I've been watching you, how I know every detail of your life, like how you take your coffee black, 2 sugars, or how you always touch that little heart necklace your mother gave you when you're stressed, just like you're doing right now." My hand froze, realizing I had indeed been fiddling with my necklace. I dropped it like it had burned me, my eyes darting to the windows. The blinds were drawn, but suddenly they felt like flimsy protection against whatever was out there. I needed to alert someone, but I couldn't disconnect the call. My fingers flew across the keyboard, sending an alert to Jake, the on-duty officer patrolling tonight. Strange call. "Caller knows details about me. Please check perimeter of dispatch center." "What do you want?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Want? Oh, Sarah, I want to play a game. I want to see how long it takes for the hunter to become the prey. You dispatchers, you're always in control, always the voice of authority. But now you're just a scared little girl, alone in the dark." I heard a noise outside and nearly jumped out of my skin. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist that I what, Sarah?" He interrupted. "Hang up. Go away." "Oh no. We're just getting started. Did you know your bedroom curtains are a lovely shade of blue? They look especially nice in the moonlight." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. He had been to my house. This wasn't just some random prank call. This was real, and it was personal. Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "Perimeter clear. No sign of anyone. Want me to come in?" I was about to respond when the caller spoke again. Ah, good old Jake. Always reliable, isn't he? But not very observant. He didn't even notice me watching from across the street. I felt sick. He could see Jake. He was close. "Jake," I said into the radio, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "He can see you. Be careful." "Oh, very good, Sarah," the caller praised mockingly. "Always looking out for others, but who's looking out for you?" I heard Jake swear over the radio, then the sound of running footsteps. "Sarah, lock the doors, I'm coming in." But before Jake could reach the building, the power went out. The dispatch center was plunged into darkness, the sudden silence of the dead equipment deafening. "Oops," the caller said, amusement clear in his voice. "Looks like someone forgot to pay the electric bill." "Don't worry, Sarah. I'm sure the backup generator will kick in soon. Unless of course, someone tampered with it." I was moving before he finished speaking, fumbling in the dark for the drawer where we kept the flashlights. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. Sarah, are you there?" Jake's voice came through my personal cell phone. I had never been so glad to hear someone's voice in my life. "Jake, the power's out." "The caller?" "He did something to the generator. I can't see anything." "I'm almost there. Just hold on." I heard the sound of the front door opening, and for a moment, relief flooded through me. But then I heard Jake's voice again, from my phone. He wasn't inside yet. "Hello, Sarah," said a voice from the darkness. It was him. He was here. I screamed, dropping my phone and the flashlight. I heard them clatter to the floor as I stumbled backwards, trying to put distance between myself and the voice. Now, he said, closer now. "There's no need for that. I just want to talk, face to face, and for once. Stay back," I warned, trying to sound braver than I felt. "The police are on their way." He laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, I'm counting on it. It wouldn't be any fun otherwise." I heard movement, the scrape of a chair being pulled out. He was sitting down, making himself comfortable, as if this was a casual visit and not a terrifying home invasion. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my back pressed against the wall. I was trying to edge my way towards the door, but in the pitch darkness, I was completely disoriented. "Why?" "Because I can, Sarah. Because it's fun. Do you have any idea how exhilarating it is to be on this side of a 911 call? To be the one causing the fear instead of calming it?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about me. This was about power, about turning the tables on the emergency system itself. Suddenly, there was a crash from the front of the building. Jake had arrived. "Ah, our guest of honor," the man said, standing up. I heard the metallic click of what could only be a gun being cocked. "Let's give him a warm welcome, shall we?" "No!" I yelled, lunging forward blindly. By some miracle, I collided with him, sending us both crashing to the floor. The gun went off, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the room. We grappled in the darkness, my training forgotten in the face of pure survival instinct. I clawed, kicked, and bit, fighting with a desperation I didn't know I possessed. Then, suddenly, light flooded the room. Jake stood in the doorway, his gun trained on us. "Police, freeze!" The man beneath me went still. It was over. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, paramedic checkups, and crime scene investigators combing through the dispatch center. The man, it turned out, was a former 911 operator from a neighboring county. He'd had a psychotic break and fixated on the idea of terrorizing dispatchers. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I sat in the back of an ambulance, more a shock blanket draped over my shoulders. Jake approached, his face etched with concern. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though we both knew it wasn't true. I wouldn't be okay for a long time. "You were incredibly brave," he said. "You saved lives tonight, Sarah, including your own." I managed a weak smile, just doing my job. But as I watched the sun rise, I knew things would never be the same. The job I loved, the job that had given me purpose, now felt tainted. The voice on the other end of the line would never again be just a stranger in need. It would always carry the potential of threat, of danger. Yet, as I fingered the heart necklace at my throat, I felt a steely resolve form within me. I had faced my worst nightmare and survived. I had fought back when it mattered most, and if I could do that, I could face whatever came next, because now I knew the truth. The line between helper and victim, between safety and danger, is razor thin, but I also knew that I was stronger than I ever imagined. And that knowledge, that was something no one could ever take away from me. So I'll go back to that dispatch center. I'll put on that headset and answer those calls, because someone needs to be there, to be the calm in someone else's storm. And now, more than ever, I know how important that is. Let them come, I thought. Let the darkness try to creep in. Because now I know, I am the light that pushes it back, one call at a time. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore turned from soothing to sinister, as I realized our island paradise had become a prison. What started as a dream family vacation twisted into a nightmare of survival, with desperate criminals holding our lives in their hands. I'd been planning this trip for months, a week on a secluded island off the coast of Maine, just me, my husband Mark, and our 2 kids, Emily, 14, and Max, 10. We'd rented a cozy cabin, packed our bags full of beach gear and board games, and boarded the small ferry with hearts full of excitement. The first few days were perfect. We hiked through lush forests, built sandcastles on pristine beaches, and spent evenings stargazing on the porch. It was the kind of quality family time we'd been craving, away from the constant buzz of phones and the demands of our busy lives. On the 3rd night, as we were roasting marshmallows around a small campfire, we heard it, the distant hum of a boat engine. It was odd. We were the only rental on this side of the island, and it was too late for the daily ferry. Mark stood up, peering into the darkness. "Probably just some locals fishing," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We sent the kids to bed, but Mark and I stayed up, an unspoken tension keeping us alert. Around midnight, we heard voices, harsh whispers carrying on the night air. Then, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Mark grabbed a flashlight and we stepped out onto the porch. In the beam of light, we saw them, 3 men dressed in dark clothes, looking as surprised to see us as we were to see them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the men, tall with a scraggly beard, raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice gravelly. "Didn't realize anyone was out here. We're, having some boat trouble. Mind if we use your phone?" Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. These men didn't look like they were on a pleasure cruise, and the way their eyes darted around set my teeth on edge. Mark, ever the optimist, started to respond. "Sure we can." He never finished the sentence. In a flash, the men were on the porch, and I saw the glint of metal in their hands. Guns. Inside, Now, the bearded man growled, all pretense of friendliness gone. Heart pounding, we backed into the cabin. I could hear Emily and Max stirring in their room, and I silently prayed they'd stay put. "Look," Mark said, his voice admirably steady. "Take whatever you want. Just please don't hurt us." The bearded man, clearly the leader, laughed humorlessly. "Oh, we're not here to rob you. You're our insurance policy." As if on cue, we heard the distant wail of sirens. The men tensed, exchanging worried glances. "Damn it," one of them muttered. "They found the boat faster than we thought." The reality of our situation hit me like a punch to the gut. These weren't just burglars or thugs, they were running from something big. The next few hours were a blur of terror. The men, who we learned were named Rick, the leader, Tony and Cal, barricaded the doors and windows. They herded us into the living room, binding our hands with zip ties. Emily and Max were terrified, clinging to each other on the couch. I tried to put on a brave face for them, but inside, I was falling apart. Rick paced the room, muttering to himself, and occasionally conferring with the others in hushed tones. From their fragments of conversation, we pieced together that they had robbed a bank on the mainland and thought they could hide out on the island until things cooled down. They hadn't counted on the police tracking them so quickly, or on finding a family of hostages. As dawn broke, painting the sky in mocking shades of pink and gold, we heard megaphones outside. The police had arrived. "This is the Maine State Police. We have the island surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Rick's face twisted with rage and fear. He grabbed me roughly, pulling me to my feet. "Looks like we need to show them we mean business," he snarled. He dragged me to the window, pushing me in front of him like a shield. "We've got hostages," he shouted. "You come any closer, and they start dying." I could see police cars and officers on the beach, their faces grim. Among them was a man in a suit, a negotiator, I guessed. "We don't want anyone to get hurt," the negotiator called back. "Let's talk about this." What followed was hours of tense back and forth. Rick demanded a boat, guaranteed safe passage, and millions in cash. The police stalled, trying to talk him down. All the while, I was acutely aware of my family behind me. Mark was trying to work his hands free, I could tell, but the zip ties were too tight. Emily was whispering comforting words to Max, showing a strength I didn't know she possessed. As the day wore on, the men grew more agitated. They argued among themselves, their nerves fraying under the pressure. "We need to make a move," Tony hissed. "They're not going to give us what we want." "Shut up," Rick snapped. "I'm thinking." But it was clear he was out of ideas. The police weren't budging, and they were running out of time. That's when I saw it. A chance. Cal, the youngest and clearly the most nervous of the three, had set his gun down on the coffee table while he paced. It was just out of my reach. But if I could somehow get to it, I caught Mark's eye, trying to convey my plan without words. He gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I need to use the bathroom," I announced, my voice shaky but determined. Rick glared at me. "Hold it, please," I pressed. "I'm about to wet myself. You don't want that smell in here, do you?" He hesitated, then nodded to Cal. "Take her, and make it quick." Cal roughly pulled me to my feet. As we passed the coffee table, I pretended to stumble. I fell against Cal, and in the moment of confusion, I managed to grab the gun. Everything happened so fast after that. I swung around, the gun now pointed at Cal. "Don't move," I shouted, my voice stronger than I felt. The other men turned, surprise turning to anger on their faces. But before they could react, Mark launched himself at Rick, tackling him to the ground. Emily, quick-thinking girl that she is, tripped Tony as he went for his weapon. It was chaos. I kept the gun trained on Cal, my hands shaking but my resolve firm. Mark and Rick grappled on the floor, while Emily and Max had managed to pin Tony down by sheer force of numbers and desperation. "Police!" I screamed, hoping they could hear us. "We need help." The next few minutes were a blur of shouting and movement as the police stormed the cabin. The men were quickly subdued and cuffed, while paramedics checked us for injuries. As we sat on the porch, shock blankets draped over our shoulders, I looked at my family with new eyes. Mark, sporting a split lip, grinning with relief. Emily, comforting a shaken but brave Max. We had faced the unthinkable and come out the other side, not unscathed, but alive and together. The detectives who interviewed us later were amazed by our story. They told us the men were wanted for a string of violent bank robberies across 3 states. Our actions had brought down a gang that had eluded capture for months. We didn't finish our vacation, of course. We were flown back to the mainland that evening, greeted by worried family members and a swarm of reporters. The story made national news, the family vacation that turned into a takedown of notorious criminals. In the weeks and months that followed, we dealt with the aftermath, nightmares, jumpy reactions to loud noises, a newfound wariness of strangers. But we also found a strength in ourselves and each other that we never knew we had. We don't go to islands for vacations anymore, but we're closer than ever, bonded by an experience that showed us what we're truly capable of when pushed to the edge. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the lapping of waves and feel a chill run down my spine. But then I look at my family, safe and sound, and I remember, we're survivors, we're fighters, and nothing can take that away from us. So if you're ever on a secluded island and you hear a boat engine in the night, trust your instincts, because sometimes paradise can turn to prison in the blink of an eye. But remember this too, even in the darkest moments, courage can be found in the most unlikely places, even in a terrified mother, even in a determined father, even in children who discover their own strength when it matters most. And that discovery, it's worth more than any vacation. It's the kind of thing that stays with you for life, a reminder that when faced with the unthinkable, we're all capable of extraordinary things. The flickering neon sign promised vacancy, but what I found in that rundown motel was anything but empty. As I stared at the tiny camera hidden behind the air vent, I realized I had checked into a nightmare of voyeurism and terror. I'd been driving for hours, pushing through the fatigue as I made my way across the Arizona desert. This solo road trip was supposed to be my grand adventure, a chance to clear my head after a messy breakup and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the miles blurred together, all I wanted was a hot shower and a soft bed. The motel appeared like a mirage in the desert, its neon vacancy sign flickering weakly against the darkening sky. It wasn't much to look at, peeling paint, a parking lot more pothole than pavement. But I was too tired to care. I pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch under my tires unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. The office was dimly lit, a single bulb casting more shadows than light. Behind the counter stood a man who looked as weathered as the building itself, his eyes sharp and alert despite the late hour. "Need a room?" I mumbled, fumbling for my wallet. He nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. Of course. How long will you be staying with us, miss? Just for the night. I'm hitting the road early tomorrow. He handed me a key, his fingers lingering a moment too long as they brushed against mine. Room 13, around back. Enjoy your stay. I suppressed a shudder as I headed back to my car. Something about this place felt off, but I was too tired to care. I just needed sleep. Room 13 was exactly what you'd expect from a cheap roadside motel. Faded wallpaper, a bed that creaked when I sat on it, and a bathroom that had seen better days. But it was a roof over my head, and right then, that was all that mattered. I took a quick shower, the water never quite getting hot enough to be comfortable. As I was drying off, I noticed something odd, a small red light blinking in the corner of the room. At first I thought it might be a smoke detector, but it was too low, tucked behind the air vent. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved closer, squinting in the dim light. That's when I saw it. A tiny camera lens, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. My blood ran cold. A camera. In my room. I quickly scanned the rest of the space, my heart pounding. There, behind a tacky painting of a desert landscape, was another one. Panic set in as the realization hit me. I was being watched. Every move, every private moment, all captured on film. But why? And by whom? The manager, it had to be him. That look in his eyes, the way his touch lingered. He knew. He'd probably been doing this for who knows how long. I had to get out of there. Fast. I threw on my clothes and started shoving my belongings into my bag. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps outside my door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. The footsteps stopped right outside. There was a moment of terrible silence, then a soft knock. "Everything all right in there?" It was the manager's voice, calm and friendly, but with an undercurrent of something sinister. I thought I heard some noise. I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. My throat had closed up with fear. "I'm coming in to check," he said, and I heard the jingle of keys. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let him in. Couldn't let him know that I'd discovered his sick game. In a split-second decision, I wrenched open the window and climbed out, not caring about the noise I was making now. I hit the ground running, my bag bouncing against my back. I could hear shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the asphalt as I made for my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, I saw him in my rearview mirror, the manager, running towards me with a look of rage on his face. I slammed on the gas, peeling out of the parking lot in a spray of gravel. In my mirror, I could see him standing there, watching me drive away. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of his stare. I drove for hours, not daring to stop, jumping at every set of headlights I saw in my mirror. My mind raced with questions. How long had he been doing this? How many other unsuspecting travelers had fallen victim to his voyeuristic scheme? It wasn't until I saw the lights of a small town ahead that I finally allowed myself to slow down. My hands were shaking as I pulled into a well-lit gas station. I needed to call the police, to report what had happened, but as I reached for my phone, a horrifying thought struck me. My wallet. In my panic to escape, I'd left it in the motel room. A wave of nausea washed over me. My ID, my credit cards, everything. It was all back there, with him. He knew my name, my address. The thought made me physically ill. I sat there, paralyzed with fear and indecision. Should I go back? The very idea made my skin crawl. But could I just leave it there, leave him with all that information about me? As I debated my next move, a pair of headlights pulled into the gas station. It was an old pickup truck. Nothing remarkable about it, but as it parked next to me, I saw who was behind the wheel, the manager. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. He'd followed me. He wasn't going to let me go that easily. I threw my car into drive, not even bothering to close my door properly. I tore out of the gas station, tires squealing. In my rearview mirror, I saw his truck pull out after me. What followed was the most terrifying drive of my life. The lonely highway stretched out before me, dark and foreboding. The managers stayed right on my tail, no matter how fast I drove or how many turns I took. I tried to call 911, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone, and out here, in the middle of nowhere, my signal kept dropping. I was on my own. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost all meaning as I focused on staying ahead, on not letting him catch me. My gas gauge was dropping dangerously low, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw it. A state trooper parked on the side of the road ahead. I've never been so happy to see a cop in my life. I screeched to a halt next to the patrol car, tumbling out of my vehicle before it had even come to a complete stop. The trooper was out of his car in an instant, hand on his weapon. "Please," I gasped, pointing back down the road. "He's after me," the motel manager. He's been following me for miles, but when we looked, the road behind me was empty. The manager's truck was nowhere to be seen. The trooper looked at me skeptically, but as I poured out my story, the hidden cameras, the chase, his expression changed to one of concern. He radioed for backup and took my statement, promising to investigate the motel. As I sat in the back of the patrol car, wrapped in a scratchy blanket and sipping lukewarm coffee, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I was safe for now, but the fear lingered, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. In the days that followed, I learned more about the manager. The police raided the motel and found evidence of his crimes. Hidden cameras in several rooms, hours of footage of unsuspecting guests. He was arrested along with a few accomplices. It turned out to be a larger operation than anyone had suspected. My wallet was recovered, thankfully, but the sense of violation, the knowledge that my most private moments had been captured on film, that wasn't so easily returned. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I see his face in crowds, jump at unexpected noises. I haven't been able to stay in a motel since, and even hotels make me uneasy. I find myself checking for cameras everywhere I go, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, but I'm trying to move forward. I'm in therapy working through the trauma. I've become an advocate for stricter laws against hidden cameras and for better security in motels and hotels. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about how close I came to being another nameless, faceless victim, and I'm grateful. Grateful that I noticed that tiny red light. Grateful that I trusted my instincts and ran, because now I know the truth. The monsters aren't always hiding under the bed. Sometimes they're behind the front desk, wearing a friendly smile and holding out a room key. And the only defense we have is to stay alert, to trust our gut, and to never, ever ignore that little voice that says something isn't right. So, if you're ever driving down a lonely highway and see a flickering vacancy sign, think twice before you stop. Because you never know who might be watching on the other side of that lens.